Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the committee's third meeting in 2021. Can I ask everyone, please, to make sure your mobile phones are on silent, and just to remind everyone that the meeting will be conducted in a virtual format. The first item on the agenda is the Climate Change Plan evidence session, and this is evidence on the government's Climate Change Plan, which has been updated 2018 to 2032. And witnesses are from across the transport sector. This forms part of a series of evidence sessions the committee is taking to inform our response to the update to the Climate Change Plan. I'd like to welcome all our witnesses. There are quite a list of them. First of all, Paul White, the Director of the Confederation of Passenger Transport Scotland, Ewan Wallace, the Chair the Society of Chief Officers of Transportation in Scotland, Colin Howden, the Director of Transform Scotland, Mark Gaynor, the Head of Railway Strategy Rail Delivery Group, Andy Jefferson, the Programme Director, Sustainable Aviation Coalition, Mag Simpson, the Head of Policy for Scotland and Northern Ireland Logistics UK, John Lauder, the Deputy CEO and Executive Director, Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland for Sustrans, Professor Gillian Hannibal, Professor of Transport and Energy from the University of Leeds, and Derek Holden, the Policy Lead in Scotland for the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. Now, before we move on to questions, I would just like to check with any members whether they want to give a declaration of interest in relation to transport, and I believe that Stuart Stevenson will want to give a declaration, so I'm going to move to Stuart Stevenson to start with. Stuart.
Claire, I'm the Honorary President of the Scottish Association for Public Transport, Honorary Vice President of Rail Future UK, and I'm co-chair of the Aviation Cross-Party Group convener.
Thank you, Stuart. And just to say, with the size of the panel that we have, it won't be possible for every witness to give an answer to every question. So the committee member will try and direct the question at the person they'd like to answer the question. And if anyone else would like to come in, just remind witnesses to put an R in the chat room, and I will do my best to bring you in. I won't be able to do it all of the time, but I will do my best. John Finney has the first questions. So the first question is John.
Panel. I'd like to direct this first question, if I may, convener, to Professor Gillian Hannibal. Professor, how confident are you that the policies and proposals set out in the Climate Change Plan update will achieve the expected emissions reductions, particularly given that transport emissions are at the same level as they were in 1990, please?
Gillian. Hold on, Gillian, sorry, we just, yep, off. No, you're muted. Hold on. Sorry, that's our fault. I think you're now unmuted and we're not going to miss anything, so Great. Off you go, please.
Thanks very much, and good morning to you all. I would say, unfortunately, that I don't hold entire confidence. I think the aspirations and the targets, so if we take the 20% reduction target as an aspiration in and of itself are good and they're sound, but the detail of how that will be delivered, indeed what it actually means, the 20% target in itself is not very well defined, and I can explain that more if you would like me to. The detail of what needs to be done is not in the plan. Most specifically, I would say that what we see in climate change plans over and over and have done since the 1990s are some good plans and proposals and eventually investments in alternative forms of transport to the passenger car. What we haven't seen in conjunction with that are policies which dissuade people from using the car. So investing in the alternatives to the car is not the same as dissuading people from using the car, and hence the modal shift benefits have not materialised. So that's one of the reasons for the failure so far. So in the plan as it stands, there is not enough to really indicate how people will be dissuaded from using the car. And that does mean talking about the costs of motoring and how we will counter the fact that motoring costs have been reducing, particularly in relation to public transport costs, and will continue to reduce because of electric motoring. And also how we are going to reallocate road space and end up with a net reduction in road space given over alternative modes. These are two very clear things which we know from evidence around the world that reductions in our travel have not happened anywhere without also dissuading people from using the car through those mechanisms.
Okay, thank you. I think perfect. You've picked it up. You're in control then, Colin.
Yeah. Thank you, Convener. I see, Mr. Howden, you wish to comment, please, and then Mr. Bolton.
Yeah, sure. So, no, I would absolutely agree with Gillian's comments there. There is a lack of detail in the plan. This was flagged by SPICE when we looked at the plan that was approved in 2018. They said that there was insufficient detail in the plan to actually carry out sufficient scrutiny. And we haven't gone any further forward with the climate change plan update. I think there's also a need for further urgency on a number of measures. So, for example, I'll give you an example of the managed motorways commitment that was made in the 2019 programme for government announcement, and there's been zero progress on that in the intervening 15 months. There's certainly insufficient scale of investment in certain measures. We flag up, for example, active travel. I'm sure John Lauder would like to talk more about that later on. I would also agree with Gillian regarding the lack of demand management measures. I can see no prospect of the 20% traffic reduction target being met without there being measures to dissuade unnecessary car use. We're not talking about all car use, we're talking about short car trips in cities, and also longer car trips where there are good, for example, rail services or coach services where you can look at switching travel to those modes. And the other thing I would flag is that while it's not picked out in the plan itself, the government has a continued bias towards high carbon capital expenditure plans. So we're talking here about new road building. And there are a number of reasons why that's not a good idea for climate change benefits, climate change perspectives, equalities. But I think fundamentally, the opportunity cost, if all the money continues to go into building new roads, will there be funding available to provide the opportunities for people to shift to sustainable transport modes of walking, cycling and public transport? So whilst there are many good things in the plan, we need more detail, we need more urgency. We definitely need to see the government come forward with demand management proposals, and we need to see a review of high carbon capital expenditure.
We're going to go to Derek next and bring him in. If I just remind all witnesses, I spoke to committee members before the meeting saying short answers are really good answers. And I know you all want to get your points across, but I promise to bring you all in. So Derek, and then back to John Finney.
Yes, and a quick answer. I mean, both Colin and Gillian have explained the importance of demand management. I think the key part that of demand management is ensuring that is aligned with the needs of businesses. We're asking people and businesses to make really tough choices about their lives, and the plan currently offers no real help with that. All the commitments under the section Our Call to Others are, we will encourage, we will very, very bland, we will have a working group to discuss how to do this. There's absolutely nothing, and there is actually no plan for how to align the real life decisions that people and businesses are going to have to make, and make tough choices that might cost businesses a bit more, might change people's lives. That's the difficult bit. And if we're not even going to start to have a plan to address the difficult bit, then I agree with Colin and Gillian, we're not going to be even close to the 20% reduction target. Indeed, it doesn't look like there's any real thought through construction of how that 20% reduction target could be achieved. So if the government doesn't actually know how it's going to achieve it or thinks it might achieve it, and we bear in mind that 9 in every 10 pounds being spent on transport in Scotland is spent by businesses and people, not by government, you know, we've got to look at sort of not 80-20 rules, but 90-10 rules, and realise that the people we need to influence are the 90%, not the 10% that there's so much detail about what government will spend.
Thank you, Derek. Back to you, John.
Yep, thank you very much indeed. I'm following your instructions explicitly, Convener. I could thank each of the witnesses all day long for very interesting replies. One further question, if I may, and I'll direct it in the first instance to Mr. Lauder, and it is about transport emissions and the targets set out in the plan. It's reliant on the widespread uptake of ultra-low emission cars, goods vehicles, buses and railway rolling stock over the next few years. How likely is this to happen, given the slow uptake of such vehicles to date, please? Mr. Lauder.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Finney. My answer to that would be it's very unlikely that we'll see a quick uptake. And I think that the magic bullet, which people, I think, are hoping for through electric vehicles is not going to be realised, because it doesn't really matter what fuel you're using to power a car. The reality is that emissions will continue to rise in the short term, particularly because the biggest uptake in new car sales in Scotland has been in SUVs, sport utility vehicles. 21.2% of new car sales, 3 times their share a decade earlier, is now with SUVs, and they emit way more carbon, 20% more carbon than the car. And that doesn't seem likely to me to be tackled at all. So building on what Gillian and Colin and Derek have said, there is no coherent plan here for the really hard stuff which needs to be led politically, which is to make it more difficult to drive for short distances. 53% of trips by car in Scotland are 5 kilometres or less, about 3 miles on average. Unless we tackle that through fuel taxation, road closures, road pricing, parking controls and speed limits, we will not really begin to tackle it. And I realise that's hard to say because, as Derek has indicated, it's a difficult change, life change for many people, and politically unpopular. And I think that the political dimension and the political leadership has been lacking to take those hard decisions. And really only in Glasgow and Edinburgh on a local authority level have we seen a really coherent strategy to persuade people and sometimes make it more difficult for people to drive. But the experience in Europe is that that's what you've got to do. You really do have to have push and pull. And as politically unpopular and ticklish as that is the only way to begin to tackle the growth and the continued dependence upon the private motor car.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
I was wondering, Ewan Wallace, do you think John would add to that? Sorry, I don't want to preempt what you're doing. I do, actually. Yeah, Ewan Wallace. Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. I was wondering whether I would put in a request to speak. You know, as the Society for Chief Officers, we obviously have the 32 local authorities and 7 regional transport partnerships, and putting strategies and policies into practice is very much the day job across local authorities. I think I would echo everything that colleagues have said about it's a really complex set of interrelated policies, and how do we make those actually happen. I'm probably slightly more glass half full in terms of I am seeing across the 32 authorities and 7 RTPs good progress to start to look at how do we make this actually happen in terms of what type of policies should we be developing. You know, there's a lot of it has been around for some time, and maybe we just need to give them a bit more teeth. But it will be difficult in terms of the conversations. It's good to see what Edinburgh and Glasgow have done. Yeah, I think all of the other cities around Scotland will be looking at that with interest. How do you take that through your formal processes and making clear what the benefits are? You know, I think that's one of the points that all the colleagues have made there. the benefits to the organisation, the benefits to society, and the benefits to the individual of getting that behaviour change. And then the only other point I would make, convener, is then as individual organisations, we also have to look at how we change both how we deliver services, but also what we use to deliver services in terms of the types of vehicles that are out there, whether you just to reduce the amount of travel we have to do, use of technology like we are just now, but also the types of vehicles that are actually being deployed. So lots of good examples for that. And I think we certainly look forward to working with all the partners and Scottish Government to make that a reality. And it's been patchy, but I think it's we have something to grab hold of to try and focus on as a wider industry. Thank you, convener.
I wonder if I just must ask you a very brief supplementary, Mr. Wallace, and it's not meant to be in any way disparaging. I'm seeking a comment. It's been suggested to me that many of the professionals in the field identify themselves as, quote, road engineers, and a lot of innovation in terms of design and structure is new to them. Would you have a view on that, please? And it's a comment, it's not a criticism. I just want to understand if you like, the teaching of engineering is changing in light of other changes.
Thank you, Mr. Finney. Yes, I can totally understand how that how that may look, because so much of the work of the society is about looking after the road network and road maintenance. I think if we look at the number of new roads that are built, it's probably not been massive actually across the 32 local authorities. Certainly, as a society, we've always called ourselves chief officers for transportation. So you always try and look at it in the round, and we want to make sure we're technically very competent at looking after what we've got. And I think we have the 7 regional transport partnerships as well, very active in terms of let's look at how we change those behaviours, what our policies are. So I can understand that perception that it is about the roads engineering. That's where I started as a professional, right back at the start of my career. But I've covered the whole remit of the transport field in terms of what has to be done on the ground, but also what we have to change in terms of their policies and strategies. So happy to, I'm sure the society would be delighted to have a conversation with any member of the committee about our work and maybe things that we need to look at going forward. Thank you, Mr. Finney. Thank you, convener.
Okay, Derek, I think you're going to come in and then we're going to go to Peter Chapman, if that's all right, John.
Yes, thank you very much indeed to witnesses.
Yes, I just thought I'd come in very quickly there because the point about skills was one of our core asks in the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport as the sort of the body representing the largest number of transport and logistics professionals in the UK. The skills and training required is absolutely, that's everybody from the roads engineer in a local authority to the petrol filling attendants that need to learn about hydrogen and microelectricity generation. And we actually look at the whole skills agenda is completely missing from the document at the minute, and is perhaps the most important issue. So just very quickly wanted to say, from our perspective, absolutely hugely important point. Let's log it and let's actually start investing in that.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go to Peter Chapman. Peter, you've got the next questions.
Yeah, thanks, convener, and welcome to the panel. I direct this initially to Colin Howden. So, Colin, I'm just saying here, why has there been no significant modal shift from travel by car to walking, cycling, or public transport over the last decade? Is this because the Scottish Government is investing in the wrong things or pursuing ineffective policy approaches? So, Colin initially, and maybe Gillian to follow on that one. Convener.
Sure. So I'd like to reflect back on RPP1, the first climate change plan going back to 2011. It set out targets for decarbonising cars, but that doesn't answer to your question. It also set out targets, however, for 10% cycle mode share and for a lot of investment into workplace travel planning and personalised travel planning. None of those 3 targets, in fact, none of the 4 targets, including the decarbonisation targets, were met over the past decade. So we've got this history of just failure against commitments, which makes us worried about the commitments being made in this plan 10 years on. I think there are other ancillary factors, however, which is that there is no price incentivization to switch to public transport. I had a look at the RAC Foundation. They say that since over the last 10 years, the price of bus travel has gone up by 80%, while the price of motoring has gone up by 13%. Cost of living has gone up by 39%. So motoring has become cheaper on average over the last 10 years, whilst bus and rail has become substantially more expensive. So there is no price incentivization for people to choose to move across to public transport on average. And the second factor I would highlight again is that where capital expenditure has gone in, it has disproportionately gone into high carbon infrastructure, so new roads. Transport Scotland reports that between 1990 and 2017, the doubling of motorway length in Scotland from 300 kilometres to over 600 kilometres. I can only think of, very small amounts of additions to the rail network, Airdrie-Bathgate, the Borders line, and so forth. And in terms of things like cycling, we haven't seen the implementation of high-quality segregated cycle routes that we really need to drive move to cycling. So it's complex, but it's a mix of, failed commitments from 10 years ago, prices not favouring a move to public transport, and also investment, capital expenditure, going into the wrong things.
Okay, thank you.
Lisa.
I mean, can I just follow up a wee bit, Convener? I mean, one of my questions is specifically about transport priorities, such as significant expansion of trunk road capacity. Do we believe that that's compatible with meeting emissions reductions targets? And I think you basically answered that and said you don't believe it is. I mean, there are plans to dual the A9 and the A96, for instance, right now. Do you feel, as an expert in this field, that that's money well spent?
Well, no, we don't. We think that money should be being spent on sustainable transport. So there's an opportunity cost of this. If you're spending the money on roads, that money is not available to spend on walking, cycling, and public transport. I mean, specifically about the climate impacts, I would say that there isn't really good data about the climate impacts of the Scottish road building programme in the round. However, I would quote some English research done by Transport for Quality of Life consultancy, which I gather that Professor Annable was a contributor to, that said that, amongst other things, that the English road building programme would negate 80% of the climate emission benefits from the move to electric vehicles. So on one hand, government is doing things that's reducing emissions, such as bringing in electric vehicles. On the other hand, constructing roads is generating more traffic.
Okay, can I go to Gillian now? I mean, you can speak about the road building as well, Gillian, but the initial question was, why haven't we moved from cars to travel by walking, cycling, or public transport? It's been it looks like a total failure over the last 10 years to achieve that. And then there's a bit about the trunk road building, if you can add on it, something on that as well, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I won't repeat what I said in answer to my initial question, which was about saying we need carrots and sticks. What we've failed to do, where we have invested in the alternatives, we have then not discouraged car use at the same time. So then we haven't improved the modal share balance. Colin has outlined a series of failures. And one of the things he outlined very clearly was the increased cost of using public transport vis-a-vis the real reduction in motoring costs. And this is key. Other failures include things like a lack of investment in 5G networks, a lack of appreciation of the role that virtual travel, i.e. through teleworking and online shopping, can make, and what that means from what we need to invest in on the public side. So remote access working, remote working hubs, understanding what it will really take to electrify the fleet and consolidate freight deliveries and the investment from the public side. smart ticketing, e-healthcare, Mars platforms. These are all things which we have actually failed, we've talked about but failed to invest in. And then one other thing I would say is that when we take the system as a whole and we look at the mode share in terms of the proportion of trips, the proportion of mileage that's undertaken by car versus other modes, what we really fail to do is think about what we focus on is the short journeys. So we focus on shifting from the car to alternative modes in local urban areas. The majority of the miles are actually undertaken on trips over 15 miles in length. So we keep talking about this huge proportion, 50% odd of trips that can be undertaken by walking and cycling, but the majority of the miles can't be undertaken by walking and cycling. And yet we actually don't invest in long distance travel in terms of rail networks, coach networks and longer distance buses. And we are not thinking about how to reduce journey lengths in terms of concerted land use planning, where we're building houses, and also thinking about putting services back into areas where those services have been stripped out. So the summary answer is that our focus is way too narrow on improving small pockets of very centralised urban alternatives to the car, active travel and bus networks, whereas the majority of travel and the majority of the problems are all the car use being undertaken on much more distributed and longer distance journeys. And that's where the failure is.
Okay, I'm going to bring in John Lord and then come back to you, Peter. John.
Thanks, convener, and thanks, Peter, for the question. I think to try and add value to what Gillian's just said, I think from a policy perspective, she's right. We have focused a lot of policy on short trips, but what I would have liked Gillian to have said was we haven't invested in tackling either those short trips to move them to active modes or those longer car-driven trips to move them to active modes. I think the particular frustration for me as somebody who holds significant funding on behalf of Transport Scotland in a grant and distributes them to local authorities in the main for projects to build infrastructure for walking and cycling is that excuse me, all the infrastructure that we build and our state partners build, the local authorities, is used. The uptake on it is positive, but the work is patchy, as Ewan Wallace said. We don't have coherent networks in our towns and cities or in our rural areas that are safe and that attract people to make that option to not use the car. We've also lost sight of the 1/3 of people in Scotland who don't have access to a car. They get a really raw deal out of transport in Scotland, so an awful lot of time is spent planning for the 2/3 of people who do own cars. That's an aside, I suppose. So to try and add value to both the previous contributors, it's a question of funding priorities, political leadership and a coherent plan. So right now, I don't really see where the work my team does fits into a national plan. We're part of a national transport strategy, the delivery plan for which is being written, but right now it's really hard for me to say where we actually lock in to a plan to help deliver a reduction in carbon. So we're doing our best, our partners are doing their best, but I'm not sure it's as coherent and joined up as it really needs to be if we're serious about reducing emissions in the transport sector.
Peter, back to you.
Yeah, well, I've one more question, convener, if I may. I'm thinking maybe Ewan Wallace, firstly, for this one. What action would you like to see the Scottish Government take to support the development of a properly integrated public transport system, particularly the integration of ticketing, timetabling and real-time information between bus, rail and ferry, and how these would work to support walking and cycling at either end of that integrated journey? So, I mean, maybe Ewan, a few thoughts on that, an integrated system.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chapman, for that. It's a nice, easy question for myself to try and deal with. I mean, Scots as a society have our members are involved in all of those different elements. I suspect that colleagues in terms of CPT might want to come in as well to give some views. I think there are some gaps at the moment in terms of how we actually deliver on a lot of these things. Particularly in terms of revenue support and how that's able to be allocated in terms of the types of passenger transport system that is available all across Scotland. And the industry's come through a very, very difficult period and has been supported through that period to try and make sure it's still there at the other end of the pandemic. There were there was lots of planning going on between authorities and Scottish Government about what the future might look like in terms of the role of public transport. If we go back 18 months, there's been a significant amount of work done on that, and both in terms of infrastructure, but then also starting to look at, well, how do you provide revenue support that predominantly falls to individual local authorities to do that. What's the value of the investment you get? What will you get that modal shift that your earlier question focused on? Because it does come down to those cost of living elements that colleagues already commented on. So I think what I think we would be looking for from a local government perspective is a different model in terms of how you actually allocate ultimately the public funding that's available to support the different types of passenger transport network. And then, as John Lodge has just said, link that into how you develop local transport plans on a regional basis in particular that links all the different modes. So I don't think any of them act against each other, Mr. Chapman, but I don't think we necessarily get the best use of the money that's available by not aligning it when we're actually developing those specific plans. But I'm pretty certain that Paul from CPT might have some strong views on this one as well. Thank you very much, Convener and Mr. Chapman. Thank you.
Yeah, Paul.
Peter, hold on. Sorry, I'm absolutely sure that Paul wants to come in, but just what I'd like to do is I'd like to bring in Mike Rumbles now, because he's got some questions on a subject which I think will bring Paul in. I'm hoping it will. I'll then come back to you, Peter, and then I'll go to Maureen, who've all got follow-up. So, Mike, I'm going to come to you now. Mike Rumbles.
Thank you very much, Convener. And actually, I'm pleased to be able to ask my questions now rather than later, because it does focus on bus transport. And we've heard just now that the cost of bus travel has gone up significantly in relative terms. And bus patronage has been in a long-term decline. And the question I wanted to ask, particularly Paul White from the Confederation of Passenger Transport, following on from all of this, how do we reverse that problem with bus patronage? Is the Scottish Government doing enough? What specifically does the Scottish Government need to do that it isn't doing now? I mean, it started well, I think, the last few years in devolution when we had the free bus pass for the over 60s, and I think that works well. But that's one initiative. What else could the Scottish Government be doing to really transform bus use, especially post-pandemic? Because, of course, what the pandemic has done is taken people completely off the buses. So practical measures the Scottish Government should and could be doing post-COVID to increase bus patronage dramatically.
Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Mr. Rumbles. Yes, bus patronage has been declining for decades, really since the rise of the private motor car, essentially. And so it's been a long-term problem. We've commissioned research at various junctures to look at that. I think our most recent research in about 2017 on the decline in bus patronage picked out some key factors. Amongst those is the cheap car use and cheap ownership, which has been already touched upon already. Societal change, so the rise of online shopping and home working, and less people journeys to the high street, essentially, and mainly congestion. The fact that bus reliability, punctuality is impacted by growing, ever worsening congestion, which in turn leads to an increase in operational costs, which in turn leads to increase in fares to cover that operational cost. So you will have seen fares rise I think what can the government do in practical terms? We have witnessed the launch of the Bus Partnership Fund and the £500 million to look at infrastructure improvements for bus, which is it's essential that we deliver that effectively in partnership with the local authorities. I think, as has been touched on by Professor Annable and others, is how do we dissuade car journeys, car use, and take some tough decisions related to that. And I think some of the excellent work that Sustrans has done through Spaces for People has demonstrated that, I would say for the first time, or certainly there's been an increase in local authorities' willingness to consider road space allocation, to consider removing car parking spaces in town centres, which has been something that our members have historically maybe struggled to get on the table when we've been looking at forming partnerships with local authorities. So in delivery of the Bus Partnership Fund, and also looking at how we can maybe use the stick to really discourage people to use the car.
Mike.
Yeah, can I just follow that? I'm well aware of all the negatives that can be done, all the stick, to use the phrase that you've just used, Paul. But I'm more interested in positive encouragement, in positive reinforcement. It works, whereas negative tends not to. So we've had small steps. For instance, I referred to the over 60s bus pass, for instance. What about radical positive solutions to make bus transport easy for everybody? I'm not advocating free use of bus transport. I'm just asking the question, would that be a feasible way of proceeding so we could actually see that step change? And I'm not terribly convinced that beating people over the head with a stick and restricting people is absolutely the way to go. There may be a need for doing some of that. But positive reinforcement, what about that?
Yeah, certainly there's two sides to it, and I think that the positive side is one that we're really engaging with local authorities through the formation of bus service improvement partnerships to look at in terms of the work that's going on in Glasgow. Within that, there is nothing off the table. We're considering what can be done in terms of limiting fares, multi-operator smart ticketing. All these things are worth encouraging. We will deliver the free travel for under 19 scheme later on in 2021. So yes, we need to make public transport as easy to use as possible. I'd like to see more done to build on the Travelling Scotland journey planning tool, so that you can look at your door-to-door journeys, link it in with walking, cycling, all modes of public transport, and also be able to purchase your tickets from that site too, which is a project that's undergoing. Which is currently underway as well. So I think I absolutely agree. There are a series of small steps involving concessionary ticketing, involving making ticketing easier, that we need to do, as well as you pointed out already, the communications that we have to do joined up with government as we come out of COVID-19 to get people back onto bus, to get to a patronage level of pre-COVID, never mind increasing it beyond that, which is our goal.
Mike, I'd like to bring in Gillian, who I think wants to come in on persuasion or punishment. I'm not sure which one it is she's coming in on for bus transport. Gillian.
Thank you very much. I'm going to throw a bit of a list at you, because I think the improvements that we can do for travel are not unknown. I mean, there are examples around, there are things that we can do. The problem is that they involve a different regulatory structure, a different finance mechanism, and also a different scale of geography over which we plan our bus services. So we need regional transport bodies, as has been mentioned, with integration across modes. We need minimum service levels for different sized places, so that each place with a certain population has a minimum number of services per day, per hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That timetable goes evenings and weekends. This is the sort of thing we see in places like the Zurich Regional Authority that are held up as the places to look at where things are done well. These things are set in legislation, the minimum standards that are required. We need the smart ticketing that has been mentioned, and just finally to say where public transport has been made free in examples around the world, Dunkirk and other places, that has not necessarily, that's seen an increase in patronage on the bus, but it has not necessarily seen a reduction in car transport. So I'm afraid I do have to make the point again about the sticks and the carrots.
Okay, I'm going to get back to Peter Chapman now, if I may, and I think he's got a follow-up. Peter.
Well, it's just if anybody else would like to comment on the integrated ticketing system, public transport system. I think this is part of the solution to what Mike's just been discussing. It's how we get people into public transport much easier, much slicker, and encourage more folk to ditch the car and use public transport. I think that ticketing system is part of that. I just wonder if there's anybody in the panel would have anything further to add on that issue, and if not, then I would prepare to move on, convener.
But Peter, please don't do that for me, because everyone will want to come in, and it'll be an uncontrollable opening of floodgates. Mark Gaynor, you haven't had a chance to say anything yet. So, Mark, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. So it was just on the ticketing and fares sort of question. So I think one of the challenges that the railway has faced is we have a very complex, out-of-date fare system, which I think has meant at times that someone buying a ticket just isn't sure whether they're getting the best value fare for the journey they want to make. So we've been pressing as an organisation for some time for fundamental fares reform to sort of simplify the fare system, make it more transparent, but also then just give operators more flexibility so that they can, adapt fares to reflect how people want to travel and work, and provide, the sort of fares which can ensure we can make the best use of the capacity on the railway. So we're not just having everyone crammed in during peak hours, but actually making use of capacity throughout the day, which I think could help with that modal shift discussion that's going on, as well as giving people confidence. Yep, I'm getting good value from my train fare.
Okay, now I think the deputy convener wanted to come in with a follow-up, which is sort of linked into this. So I'm going to go to Maureen Watt. Maureen Watt, you have a question on this.
Yeah, thank you. I think what I've heard so far much from an urban perspective, and where you have densely populated areas, it seems to me that what's been said so far would further disadvantage people in rural areas when you don't want them to have decent roads, get to their work, and to be able to, where there is no rail or buses service, and discouraging car use. I mean, if we are talking about electric cars, surely they should be allowed to use those on decent roads. But my question was in terms of, we've passed legislation in relation to low emission zones, which haven't been mentioned, and the need for increasing the use of park and ride, especially when low emission zones are implemented. So I think you're very much looking at it from an urban perspective, disadvantaging rural people who live in rural areas, keeping them at economic disadvantage, or are you wanting everybody to move into urban settings, and the use of LEZs and what difference they will make to getting that modal shift in the urban area?
Thanks, Maureen. I think what I'll do is I'll go to Colin Howden first, and then probably come to Derek just for a view on logistics, and if anyone else wants to come in, they can let me know. So, Colin, would you like to head off on that one briefly, and then sure. Derek, and then I'll try and bring in the other can.
Thanks, Convener. I'll try to be brief. So low emission zones, we haven't led anything on low emission zones in our evidence. That's just primarily because we would see low emission zones as being a policy intervention designed to reduce air pollution. rather than climate change. We're certainly in favour of the implementation of low emission zones. We have Edinburgh and Glasgow councils both within our membership, and we support them on that. So happy to promote LEZs, but we don't have detailed evidence to lead on that here. In terms of the rural issue, briefly, no, I hear what you're saying in terms of availability of public transport in rural areas compared to urban areas. What I would say is that the road traffic demand management measures that we would advocate, whether they be local road user charging schemes under the 2001 Act, or workplace parking levy schemes under the 2019 Act, or we could be looking at out-of-town retail parking levies perhaps in the future. All of these things would largely have effect on urban areas, and there may even be price benefits for rural travel out of that if we can focus pricing of transport on areas that are more congested and more polluted.
Okay, so I'll just make a comment before we pass on. The nearest bus passes to my house 8 miles in one direction and 15 miles in the other, and I'm sure I'm no different to many rural people. So getting that initial bit is a long walk on a cold and wet night where you can't see your hand in front of your face. But I'm going to go to Derek, and then I'll come back to anyone else who wants to come in. Gillian. So Derek, followed by Gillian.
Yeah, I think we'd like to sort of come back on some of the points being made about sticks and government needing sticks. I mean, my usual response to that is, will brave politicians usually become unemployed fairly fast when they start dealing with these transport issues? And so it's back to my very first point, that this is about dealing with people's lifestyles, and it's not just a rural-urban question. Urban areas are very diverse too. So actually how we plan, I mean, top-down delivery is a very blunt instrument, whereas bottom-up delivery, if you can distribute the money better to enable the bottom-up delivery to happen in a more diverse and distributed way, it all works. I mean, the fastest growing, let's say, of our members, the fastest growing transport operator will probably be Amazon at the minute. And the thing is, one of the reasons why Amazon's growing so fast is because they focus on people and focus on how they can give a door-to-door transport service for people that's as effective as possible. Now, it doesn't need to be unsustainable approaches that grow quickly. It can be sustainable approaches that grow quickly too. And I think so my point would be, can we start to deliver the money? And so bus is a really good example. I mean, concessionary travel is effectively an urban-centric bus investment policy. We really don't.
Derek, I'm sorry. I gave you a sort of warning in the chat room. Okay. I want you to concentrate on LEZs, if we may, because if I bring it and they review everything that's been said before, I'll never get to the next question. So a specific point on LEZs.
Yeah, so I certainly wanted to go back. The LEZ's point, I mean, Colin's made the point about them predominantly being about air quality. But one of the real things we can use them for is to decarbonise our bus industry. Now, if we look at say that we're now at the point where the whole life cost of an electric bus is lower than a whole life cost of a diesel bus, so we could gain a productivity benefit for the Scottish economy by having 100% electric vehicle fleet. So the Scottish Government last year said, we can maybe stop having the ultra low carbon bus investment thing because now the whole life cost. No, it's actually the reverse. We put a lot more money into that, and LEZs are one of the tools that could help push and encourage bus operators to prioritise the rate at which they move, with a lot more support from Scottish Government. It's great to see last week's announcement on a further round of ultra low carbon. But that's the sort of thing we need to do. We need to actually have both the push and the shove, but in ways that make the industry change from Amazon to First Bus.
Okay, Gillian, and then I'll come to Paul White, and then back to you, Maureen, very briefly. So Gillian, followed by Paul.
Thank you. On the rural-urban issue, where we have something like a 20% reduction target, not everywhere is going to be able to reach 20% reduction, but that means that there are places that have to reach more than 20%. So just to bear that in mind. And what we're not saying in any of this is that the car has to disappear. Of course it doesn't. The car is very much part of the solution. And in rural areas, it is possible to structure the charges, say road use charging, so that people who live in rural areas at the moment and commute in to urban areas by car, pay for parking, pay for petrol duties, etc., actually it's price neutral for them. So there are ways and means with any of the mechanisms we talk about to look at different groups in society, to look at different locations, and and adjust the policies and the pricing mechanisms and so on in order to make sure that certain people aren't disbenefited. On low emission zones, they are currently quite a weak mechanism because they are targeted at air pollution, and most of the LEZs, or when I'm thinking countrywide here in terms of England and Scotland, have decided not to act on cars mainly, but think about improving bus technology. That is very important, but the speed with which, as an earlier comment made, people are taking on high polluting cars. So for every one electric vehicle that's sold at the moment, about 20 SUVs, and we are locking in a lot of fossil fuels into the past 2030. If the low emission zones do not start to really target those higher carbon emitting cars and really start to discourage them from being sold, then we have absolutely no hope of meeting our carbon commitment targets from transport because of SUVs alone. And that has been highlighted by the International Energy Agency at a global level. SUVs were the only thing last year to have contributed to carbon emission increases globally, and that is also what's happening nationally.
Okay, we go to Paul. I think you may have some comments on this, Paul.
Yes, so the low emission zones that are currently in place or will be introduced in the coming couple of years set initial targets for bus related to the Euro standard of buses. And I think in terms of using that as a tool towards bus decarbonisation, while Derek mentions whole life costs, the upfront capital costs there remains a huge difference between the upfront capital cost of a zero emission bus and a Euro 6 diesel bus. And given the tight turnaround to reaching 100% targets for bus of Euro 6 standard or above, it becomes difficult to look how you could move the fleet towards zero emission on that time scale. I think the work of the Bus Decarbonisation Task Force and the targets within the Climate Change Plan relating to the majority of buses being zero emission from 2024 are they're probably the ways to deliver that path, that transition to zero emission, rather than using the low emission zones, which would generate a huge cost for operators at a very small over a very small time scale.
Thanks, Paul. Maureen, it's fairly comprehensively covered. Are you happy with that answer?
Yeah, I would just say, Aberdeen's managing to roll out its hydrogen buses, and we heard last week about the problem with SUVs. Obviously, charging or road tax for them is not within our gift. And I think if you're talking about road charging policies, then you must have decent roads for people to use if you want to charge, make use of charging. So dualling of main roads is still required, especially, for example, in the southwest of Scotland. I just find it deeply frustrating. I mean, Ewan Wallace is in a rural area, and here in the northeast we've got to have people using Park and Ride in order to keep cars out of the city centre of Aberdeen, in order to get that reduction in emissions, and together with car parking charges, workplace car parking, surely we can get some of the shift that our panel are talking about in that way.
Okay, and I'm very briefly about Gillian into giving an answer on that, to try and keep people, I think Maureen's trying to insinuate that doing more in the cities would allow rural people still to move around. Do you want to briefly comment on that, and then we'll go on to the next question?
my comment on that is that when you actually look at the travel patterns, there's a lot of travel from rural areas into urban areas. And whilst parking charges are very important, and low emission zones, if they had teeth and actually charged according to the carbon footprint of any journey, including cars, would be important, they would actually also hit rural areas or people travelling in from rural areas in quite a blunt fashion. Whereas if you have a pay-per-use mechanism of those roads, you can adjust those charges according to which roads are being used at which times, in which vehicle you are doing them. And in that way, you can actually improve the fairness of the mechanisms. The charging in the town centres is really quite a blunt thing. And the other thing to say is that, as I said before, an awful lot of journeys are not urban and in and out of urban areas. And we have free parking at retail centres on the outskirts areas, free parking in our tourism spots and this kind of thing. And these are also generating the majority of the carbon. Commuting is actually only about 15–18% of the carbon from travel. The rest, most of it, is leisure and shopping. And so the charges actually really need to be on use and not at the destination side.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next questions, which are from Stuart Stevenson. Stuart.
Thank you very much, convener. I've used the time to just do a couple of things that are interesting. I've discovered that in the last 7 years, I have used the same number of miles in my car as I did in my first full year as a parliamentarian. And in the interim period, I've transferred from using my car all the time to travelling by train and to some extent by bus. So if somebody like a busy MSP can do it, I can do it as well. But the issue of getting this 20% reduction in car usage has been quite exhaustively covered. But the one thing I haven't quite heard, and I might start with Gillian to just round that one off, is what actual policies could the Scottish Government introduce that would make a real difference? And I'm going to propose one myself, which there was a referendum in Edinburgh about some years ago which failed, which was road pricing. But what else could we actually do? Because I'm hearing the problem described, but I'm hearing rather less about the solutions. And perhaps Gillian first.
Okay, so we'll go to Gillian, and then we'll probably try and bring in Mags on whether it's a good idea, road pricing for logistics. So Gillian first.
Okay, I do think road pricing is key. I think, though, that the congestion charging, rather than national road pricing, where you are maybe sometimes not paying anything for use, but other times, wherever you might be, paying something. So a national scheme that's really quite sophisticated with respect to the roads that you're on and the time that you're using them. I think what we really have to start to talk about is destination shifting, not just mode shifting. So we keep talking about mode shifting, but what we really need to do is reduce journey lengths. And the way in which we do that is replace some journeys by virtual means. And so anything that we are talking about in terms of the transport system must include the investment in 5G networks and fast broadband. That is part of the transport system, absolutely no doubt. The other thing is that we have to stop building houses and other things in car-dependent locations. We have to put services back in to smaller towns in terms of improving very local high streets, improving the attraction of local areas. And the experience over the past year with COVID, we need to understand where that has worked for people and where that hasn't. Where has it been a better experience for people having to use their local areas? Where has it not been? And this is a huge opportunity to learn and see how we can keep people using their local areas as we go forward, because it's so much part of the solution. So I really would like to see a shift in emphasis, not away from modal shift. Modal shift is important, but really not thinking that unless we actually reduce the total amount of travel in the system, we're not going to get anywhere. And I just want to illustrate that with one other point that I think really concentrates the minds. We all talk about the Netherlands. We see that 29% of trips in the Netherlands are undertaken by bike compared to 1-2% in Scotland. We think they've got it sorted. Well, they haven't, because the carbon footprint from travelling per capita on average in the Netherlands by Dutch people is as much as it is in Scotland. Why? Because they also own cars, they own large cars, and they use them on longer distances. They do more of everything in the Netherlands, and their distances are longer that they travel. And that's why we can't just focus on mode splits, on improving a percentage of active travel. We have to talk about bringing the number of kilometres down, and we do that by looking at journey length.
Gillian, just before we go on to Max, can I just ask a supplementary for that? It's all very well saying putting services locally, but my local shop, which is 8 miles away, has a very, very poor selection, and it's never going to get a bigger selection because there isn't a demand for it. So I am forced to go, like many people across Scotland, to bigger outlets to buy the goods that I need, so I've got the choice that I can get. Now, your suggestion is fine, but is it really realistic? Gillian, that's to you. Sorry, you're muted. I've missed your defence, Gillian. You're muted.
Okay.
It's
very difficult in a forum like this because everything is so complicated and joined up, so you don't keep wanting to say that. But you're absolutely right. In order for this to work, you then also have to make sure that large out-of-town retail sites are paying their way, and people have to pay to park there, and reduce the business rates in local areas on shops so that they have a disproportionate advantage. Increase.
Sorry, I've got to interrupt you there, because that's all very well to say that, to make you pay for the parking when you go there. I'm paying for the luxury of having to travel because there's nothing local for me to go there. And like many people will object to paying for the parking at the other end.
I agree, but it's about changing the balance of opportunities. Local shops have been stripped of their ability to grow and keep the large stock because they're not being used as much, because they aren't their overall costs to run are more expensive. So you're right, it's not just about putting the shops back in, but it's about giving them relative advantage over the larger retail outlets that do exist. And that's a whole complex set of business rates and parking opportunities and all kinds of things. It's not just about the provision, it's about the relative advantages and ensuring that these places can thrive and offer the selection that they need to in order to attract the trade.
Okay.
It's not a solution for a transport problem.
I'm going to go to Mags and let her come in on that, and then I'll come back to Stuart. Mags.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Clearly, a lot of the chat has been about private cars, which is not relevant to us, but for freight and logistics point of view, I pick up on a point that was just made about road user charging. We're in the process of going to our members about this, because in the past we've historically been quite anti-road use charging. However, the industry absolutely recognises that it's about allocation of road space and it's about reducing congestion, and our industry is going to do everything it possibly can to reduce emissions and improve air quality. But it's not a straightforward solution for us. There are so many levers, there's so many different types of vehicle across the industry. And I don't think it should be forgotten that the freight and logistics industry exists because of the demands of society. So the trucks are on the road because society demands whatever goods and services it's looking for. To pick up on a lot of chat, a lot of the conversation has also been about road building, and I think it's important to not forget that Scotland is quite literally at the end of the supply chain, and we need to maintain the infrastructure, whether that's road, rail, sea, air, and we need to make sure that the goods and services can keep moving across the communities, and that includes obviously the rural element of Scottish communities. And I think another point, maybe just to put the freight and logistics in perspective, 90% of the freight that's moved around is moved by road. Now, we fully support modal shift, and when we talk about modal shift, moving from road perhaps to rail, or indeed waterborne freight where it's appropriate. But it's important not to lump freight logistics altogether, because there's so many different dynamics within that. So, for example, timber, a very heavy product that can be moved by rail quite sufficiently, and that would take trucks off the roads. But you're not going to start putting all the supermarket stock on the back of a train to get it locally around the cities of the country. Forgive me that there's been so much discussed, a lot of it's irrelevant from a private car point of view, but the logistics industry is here to do what it can, and absolutely recognises it has a part to play.
Thank you, and important points there. So back to you, Stuart. I think you've got further questions.
Thank you. I had to put a smile on my face when Gillian said 5G is going to be the answer. Since where we live, we have no 4G, no 3G, and we never had 2G. And you know, it's a half-mile walk to get the barest of signals. So 5G is just a joke in rural areas, to be blunt about it. But back to the agenda before the committee before us today. And I just wonder, how do we get more ultra-low emission vehicles, both commercial and private? And I have in my mind a recollection, and it might have been only in the USA, there was a legal requirement for manufacturers of cars to achieve an average MPG for the fleet, for the cars that they sold. Isn't that still the case? And if it isn't, is that something that could nudge us away from SUVs with their much higher consumption towards vehicles that are more effective? Or there are other ways that we can get low emission vehicles. I mean, 18 months ago, my wife and I were in Norway, and in Bergen, you never heard any traffic because virtually all of the traffic was electric vehicles. And I believe that over 50% of vehicles now sold in Norway are electric vehicles. What are they doing that we could be doing that would make the difference? And I think probably if we went back to Colin Howden, that would probably be a useful start for that one.
Thanks for that, Stuart. If I could briefly answer your previous question, I could have a go at that as well. So 3 things I think you could do to...
Absolutely not. Absolutely, you've got to stay on the target.
Oh, no.
Sorry.
A shame. So how to incentivize uptake of ultra-low emission vehicles? It's not really a thing that we led in our evidence, so I'm not going to answer that question in detail. My understanding is that Norway has high car purchase taxes, Denmark as well, so I think there's a different sort of model of pricing for car ownership there. So perhaps that's something that we should be looking at, following our Norwegian and Danish model.
Ewan, do you want to come in on that? Is that something you would feel comfortable answering?
Yes, thank you, convener. Yeah, I was about to, maybe saw me heading towards the keyboard there just to put a request to speak. So it is one of the things I mentioned earlier about you as local authorities. We are looking at how we do what we do, and vehicles is a large part of everything that a local authority takes forward. Scots as a society has large numbers of us look at the fleet side of things. The 2030 timescale will focus the minds. I think a practical thing will be that every organisation then has to think about how they deal with that. So in a roundabout way, we've basically been asked to set out what our plans are going to be to make sure that we can't buy any more petrol and diesel after that as public bodies. There's that concern that there might be a bit of a surge for people to purchase the existing vehicles in 2029 and use them for as long as possible. And I think as a society, we're trying to encourage knowledge sharing in terms of what's working. With my day job hat on, convener, I've seen a significant shift over the last 3-4 years. And I think we'll start to see lots of other organisations putting in place those ultra low emission vehicles up to 7.5 tonnes. Once you start into the higher payload vehicles, it then gets more difficult. There's significant amounts of work on whether the opportunities around hydrogen, and we've seen that in the northeast, in particular on the bus side of things. But the technology is very similar in terms of powertrain, refueling opportunities, the training of drivers, the training of mechanics, all of those things. The ability to do that as trials across Scotland is a really, really positive thing, and the Scottish Government have committed to doing more work about what that large fleet, the larger vehicle fleet, is going to look like. The smaller stuff, I think that the technology is coming. It's picking up pace. They're still expensive, and local authorities are getting support to be able to put those onto the fleet, and they're finding them to be of benefit. They cost less. They're cleaner to look after. They're becoming increasingly more reliable. I can remember the first generation of these vehicles, and they spent more time on a low loader going back to be repaired, potentially, than they did actually being used to go around the network and undertake their different duties. So definitely I think there's a lot of opportunities around that. It's going to take time. New technology, as it starts to kick in, will start to come under pressure, I'm sure, within the next 3-4 years, as 2030 starts to loom very, very large for us all, and how we're going to comply with that, no longer being able to purchase those vehicles when we get into 2030. So I hope that helps a little bit in terms of where I think as local authorities we are in terms of the shift to ultra low emission vehicles. Thank you.
Okay, Stuart, back to you.
Just briefly, convener, because I'm watching the clock, how do we actually ban the sale of diesel and petrol vehicles from 2030? It's a Scottish Government objective. I'm pleased to say it's now also a UK Government objective, and that may contain the answer, because I'm not sure that the Scottish Parliament actually has the legal powers to do anything like that. It might be able to restrict access of such vehicles to roads and so on and so forth, but I suspect that actually we can't ban it. So what does this ban actually mean in practical terms, I wonder? I'm a little uncertain who to address that at. Well, why don't we stick where we are and hear from you?
Sorry, back to you and then, okay?
Very, very quickly, convener. Yeah, good point in terms of practicalities. And I think every authority will absolutely be looking at what they are required to do. But I think the bigger question that every authority will be looking at is, well, what is our own carbon footprint in terms of the functions that we undertake? And what part will we play in achieving the move to net zero by 2045? So therefore there's almost a sort of, you put to one side, okay, we maybe can't ban that as it's currently constituted, and there might need to be a shift in terms of that. But the aspiration and the plans of every organisation, and I would put that out to across the private sector as well, that they would have to look at that in terms of what their actual contribution is. Whether there's a loophole or not, and certainly I know that in the local authority side of things, we are all looking at what our contribution is, and that's a big part of it. So.
Okay, Stuart, if you're happy with that, I'll move on to Richard Lyle with his questions.
Yep, thanks.
Okay. Thanks very much, Stuart. So, Richard, yours are the next question.
Thank you, Convener. My question is to you. 2030, as Stuart said, is coming very fast. Where are we going to go to charge our electric cars? What additional electric vehicle charging infrastructure will we need to be in place by 2030 to support widespread uptake of electric cars, particularly for those living in tower blocks, flats, tenements, homes without private parking? And do you agree with me, something I've been pushing for years, should new homes now be built with charging electric points?
Ewan, looks like you're on the firing line.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Convener. And it is one that the society is very much involved in, both locally and every local authority. So some members of the committee will have seen things come through already. Everybody's working up what their it's not so much the strategy, it's the delivery plans. So where will we put them? We're rolling them out as much as possible in lots of locations. So they'll be in public car parks. Work with private sector. They will be installed increasingly in the destinations that Professor Nable's talked about, whether it's out of town, whether it's town centres. There is a difficulty, I suppose, in the urban areas about on street. Is that actually going to be feasible for a lot of locations? So my colleagues in the bigger cities are trying to work through what that looks like. At the moment, the range, top range vehicles, you're maybe talking 300 miles plus. So therefore, when you go to charge, will you charge at your home? I would agree, absolutely. There should be something brought forward that part of the specification for new build has that as part of it. At the moment, retrofitting costs several £1,000s, and there's grants available to assist that. So you stick all of those things together. I always pose the question to colleagues, well, how do you currently get the energy for your mode of choice at the moment? You go to a central location and put a liquid into your fuel tank. So it may well, but are we really going to build those everywhere? I think it's a more dispersed model. So it will be in all the different locations. It's easier to do than build a petrol filling station, that's for sure. So there's a whole range of activity going on at the moment, Convener, around EV, and local authorities working together with industry and Scottish Government to put that out. Back to my earlier comment, patchy. It's just not quite. But it's picking up pace. Is what we're seeing across our membership. So that helps a little bit from the question from Mr. Lyle.
Yeah, again, the problem is, you can turn up at a petrol station and fill up in 5 minutes, but an electric car, it'll take more than 5 minutes to charge it up. I think you'll have to have a long tea break if you can find somewhere to have a cup of tea. But basically, that is the problem that we're going to face in the next number of years. I'll move on for the sake of time, Convener. I'll move on.
Richard, before you do, can I just bring Gillian in on that, just on the charging points?
I was going to ask her next, that same question.
Okay, perfect, because I'll let you ask a question, but just as you're floating it, one of the evidence sessions that we heard as a committee, that there are some local authorities who are constructing charging points on lampposts if people are unable to get charging from their house because they're in a flat or so and so. I think Milton Keynes was suggested, but sorry, back to you, Richard, and maybe Gillian could consider that.
I actually am working with a company who are looking at that, and my view is that you could put it on a lamppost. You could do it, we all know that cabling has went on for broadband in different areas. So basically, at the side of the pavement, you could lift a small lid and plug in. Gillian, I was very interested in your comment in regard to Holland. My mother-in-law was Dutch, and I totally agree with the points that you've made. But again, Gillian, and you answer the question about charging points, but can also ask you, can our electricity generation and distribution infrastructure support the widespread uptake of electric cars? And if not, what changes need to be made and by whom? If you can answer those two questions, that'd be good.
Okay, thank you. On the charging infrastructure, I think everything Ewan said, in that at the moment it's very patchy, and we haven't got good strategies of how to put the charging infrastructure in these diverse types of use cases. So in the residential areas where there's mainly on-street parking, etc. It's all very patchy. Now, there's huge innovation happening in on-street parking type charge points. So you mentioned the lamppost, there's pop-up lanyards, and there's initiatives to get people to share their own charge points in the sort of sharing economy type phenomena. So I think, I'm not saying it's not a problem, but I do think that innovation is going to happen quite quickly. And as with Norway, what's happened in Norway is not that the charging points went in first and that's encouraged the 50% over 50% uptake. What's happened in Norway is you've had the uptake happening rapidly, and they've sorted out the charging situation. And so really the main issue is how to really incentivize the vehicles, and I think the charging infrastructure and the innovation will come from that. But I do think that uptake, by the way, in Scotland has some of the most intense and most rapid pockets of uptake of electric vehicles in the UK as a whole. And some of that is to do with a sense of green electricity in Scotland, and it making sense to own it because it is sort of more genuinely environmentally making sense to people, because they're tying the whole thing themselves in with the fact that electricity is getting more and more renewable, and that is really quite an important part from the sort of public, from the consumer attitude side, as well as from the system initiative. But I think what we really have to do is go much more quickly in Scotland with respect to public procurement. So having much earlier dates by which time fleets, public sector fleets, are turned over to electric vehicles. We need a much better way of managing the local charge point infrastructure, and I think Derek Howden has submitted some suggestions on that in his evidence, and we certainly need to make it more resilient and make sure it works. What is there at the moment is often not working properly. We need to adapt local planning guidance, as was mentioned. So yes, every new house should have the facility for charging in it, and we need a proper residential charge point scheme. So not just thinking and hoping that it's going to happen, but actually a rollout, or an identification of where electric vehicle uptake is going to be most rapid, because we have some good guesses through demographics and current car ownership of where the EVs are most likely to be taken up, and then rolling out the infrastructure in a targeted way in residential streets in order to get better value for money, rather than at the moment the very piecemeal, leaving it to some experiments and the local authorities that actually have some time and some resources and enthusiasm for this.
Mags, would you like to come in? Sorry, I want to bring Mags in, Richard, if I may. She's supposed to come in on that. Mags,
yeah. Just to give you some sort of real life examples, as it were, clearly electrification is accepted within our industry as a potential solution for vans. Now, infrastructure is obviously a key concern, but we've also had members who've said, right, we'll buy in 10, 12, 15 electric vans, but they've then been told by their electricity provider that they have to build a substation on site because there isn't the grid capacity to bring in larger vehicles in any sort of sensible quantities. And it is just to be aware that part of the equation is also the capacity across the grid. And if you're going to bring in large numbers, which is obviously what we want to do, we need to ensure that there's the opportunity and the funding to make the power source available. One other point I just wanted to make briefly was, again, we had our freight councils this week, and we asked our members for some input as to their experiences using alternative fuels. And one member did point out that it's much easier to get access to public charging points in Scotland because you only need the one card apparently as a commercial user, whereas across England you need several cards because of all the different regions, authorities, whatever it is. So it's just to pass that on. Obviously Scotland is doing that part right. So if you have got a commercial vehicle, you can get access to the charging points that are there. But clearly demand for access to these points is going to increase as more people convert to electric vehicles. It was just to make that point, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much, Mags. And back to you, Richard.
Yeah, Mags, the Scottish Government actually has a scheme where you can apply for funding to erect a charging point, but we have situations where housing associations won't allow people to do that because they actually don't have a designated parking space. How do we solve that?
Well, forgive me, I'm not obviously to represent the private car owner, but it's something that industry is going to have to look at.
Yeah, okay. That's fine, Convener, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll pop now to Emma Harper. You've got some questions. Emma, over to you.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. I was waiting until my camera came on. There's been lots of discussion this morning about private car usage, but I have a couple of questions about a modal shift to walking and cycling. And we know we need to change the way that people take up alternative methods away from their private cars. And I know that the Scottish Government created an e-bike grant fund, and there's also a commitment for £500 million in active travel over the next 5 years. So what else do we need to do to encourage people to take e-bikes or e-cargo bikes, for instance? And know that that would be for certain shorter journeys, as Gillian has mentioned, we need to reduce our journeys. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on a modal shift for walking and cycling.
Was that to Gillian? Did
Well,
I?
It could be for Gillian and for Sustrans, please.
Okay, so sorry, I misheard that. So we'll go to John Lauder first, followed by Gillian. John.
Thank you, Convener. Thanks, Emma. Good question. So I think that what we've been saying this morning, myself, Colin, Gillian, Ewan, is that we are delivering some really innovative and good projects in Scotland. The budget that you've mentioned, £100 million a year for the next 5 years, is really welcome. I would make a comment about it, though, that we're at the point now where, for Sustrans, where we are funding with our statutory partners, that our budget is at capacity. So we're going to find it increasingly difficult to meet the demand that's out there from local authorities and other statutory agencies. So we've got a really great opportunity to grow the budget, is what I'm saying. And I know that lots of people will come in front of you and say their budget should increase. But I'm saying to you that the budget that I control is now at capacity, and it'll flatline now for the next 5 years. So I'm really, really worried about meeting demand, because I think there's a great opportunity, especially when a lot of Scotland's workforce is at home. And in particular, there's a great opportunity to deliver what's a kind of trendy term as a 20-minute neighbourhood, which is basically making it easy for you to get all the things that you need as much as you can within a 20-minute context. Different in a rural context, I totally accept that, although many rural towns, of course, could be a fantastic 20-minute neighbourhood and should be. You've asked about e-cargo bikes. I think there's a huge opportunity for agencies, public agencies and the private sector, to work together. You can move an awful lot of goods and services for last mile deliveries. We've mentioned Amazon already today, but there's lots of other parcel companies delivering who could transfer to either, as Mags was saying, electronic vans, but also for last mile deliveries, particularly to fit in with low emission zones, which Maureen touched on, by bicycle. We've got some great partnership working out there. We can demonstrate what can happen, but this isn't the first time I've been in front of the committee to say we've got really good evidence. I can give you lots of good reports, but the work that we do is quite patchy in the sense that we've got a limited budget and therefore local authorities have to bid in. We're not doing this uniformly across Scotland in as uniform a way as we possibly could. The second thing to say then is that what the public want, and we know this from evidence, is that the public are very clear that they will take an option to use a bicycle or to walk when it's feasible and when they feel it's safe to do it. And that very often means in a dense urban context, in big cities and towns, that means segregating cycling from pedestrians and cycling from cars, which is the Northern European model. We've got some good examples of that now on the ground in Glasgow. We've got developments in Edinburgh, Stirling, Arbroath, other towns and cities in Scotland. And we've got some great rural initiatives connecting villages to towns where the distance is maybe a mile and a half. There's issues about maintenance and funding of maintenance, particularly at a local authority level and in a rural context. You might touch on that. But I think what I'm saying to you is, I feel the door is open, and with more funding, we could do a lot more in Scotland. We've got great examples. The rest of the UK looks to us for leadership in this area. So with more investment, we could do more. That would be my absolute plea to you, to the committee. Thank you.
Gillian, I promised you in next, I think. Gillian.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll just quickly focus on e-bikes because I'm really pleased that they've come up. I truly believe that these are really important to play in the decarbonisation agenda for transport. We've done some analysis where we've investigated the types of car trips that might be able to be switched over to electric bikes. So in terms of distance, in terms of the proportion of the population that are fit enough, in that you still need some fitness to travel on an electric bike, and in terms of the proportion of journeys that don't involve people carrying a lot of stuff. And we've concluded that the greatest potential for from the car to e-bike journeys exists not in the centre of urban areas where we're tending to focus some of the attention. If we are putting in things like e-bike sharing schemes, we're tending to put them in the centre of sort of larger towns and cities that have other options and don't really need the e-bikes, because the e-bike potential is for those sort of 5 to 10 mile journeys happening that are crisscrossing all over the place, not necessarily into urban centres, and also between smaller towns. What that means, though, is that we really do need to think about where we're putting in the infrastructure, because it's not just e-bikes, making them sexy, maybe giving grants out. We still need people to want to use them and go onto the roads because they feel it's safe enough. So we're, again, as a country, we're behind many other European countries in e-bike uptake, because places like the Netherlands that I mentioned before, who you would have thought had squeezed out all the cycling it could, e-bikes are reaching places that conventional bikes didn't reach, reaching places, reaching people, because the infrastructure is there. And finally, they're starting to see a dent in some car use because of e-bikes. So I think we need to think about longer distance cycling networks that really can target some of these places that are not radial routes into urban centres, that are picking up some of the other types of 5 to 10 mile journeys that are really difficult to hit with bus routes, and certainly not conventional walking and cycling, but where e-bikes could make a huge difference.
Thank you. Emma, is back to you, I think.
Yeah, thanks, convener. I'm interested, obviously, as a a bike rider myself, and I've seen a lot of people take up e-bikes during lockdown, and that's been very successful because they know that they can probably go 10 miles instead of 5 miles, or do twice the journey that they would normally undertake. I know the Scottish Government have announced a £50 million fund for active travel freeways, but they haven't really defined what the freeways are, and I'm assuming that would be safe, segregated, active travel cycleways, for instance. Do we need another active travel fund, or is this something that we should just really be funding existing processes or that are there already? I'm interested to that, if we really do need to specifically have an active travel fund, and so that would be this £50 million for active travel freeways.
Okay, we'll go to John, and then Derek wants to come in on that. So John briefly, followed by Derek.
Thanks, convener. Thanks, Emma. So my answer to that question is that currently there's 100 million a year, as you've said, being invested by Scottish Government in active travel, walking, cycling, wheeling, infrastructure and smarter choices, so encouraging people to take those options. That's fixed. My plea would be that yes, we need a really high quality active travel freeway or highway network. We have submitted some ideas to the Strategic Transport Project Review because I think that's a strategic national initiative. I would be, as I've just said, the £60 million a year that Sustrans manages, which is match funded by local authorities who are in receipt of grants that we give out for infrastructure, that budget's at capacity. So I can't do any more. I couldn't fund a strategic active highway network from that. So the talk of the 50 million, which is a bit vague, and I'm struggling to pin it down with the civil service what that really means. That sounds really brilliant. And if that was a standalone fund, and it was invested in that network, and that network was rolled out in a partnership between local authorities, regional transport partnerships, other statutory bodies, Sustrans, perhaps built on the back of the existing national cycle network, that would be brilliant. And as Gillian has just said, when you have electric bikes, the distance that you can go grows that much more, and headwinds are less of an issue, and gradient is less of an issue because it's almost like cycling with a tailwind wherever you go. So, and the distance you can do, just as in a car, is growing as battery efficiency grows. So that network could be absolutely fantastic. So warmly welcome the idea. I'd love to see it embraced by the Strategic Transport Project Network and adopted almost like a trunk road network for cycling and walking. And also, it would have a fantastic economic dividend, particularly for rural Scotland and deeply rural Scotland, because it allows people to get out on defined routes and tour and spend money as they go, because as you say, you can't carry a lot on a bike. So, brilliant idea, just need to see it pinned down. I think that's my theme of the morning. Please help us to pin down what it is we want to do, when we want to do it, and the funds available, because we're here to support and work in partnership to do that. Thank you.
Okay, and we will get the chance to pin the government ministers down when they come in for the session that they'll be giving on this. So I'm going to go to Derek on e-bikes. Derek.
Yeah, I mean, it was specifically Emma's question about do we need a fund? And the thing is, the same answer I'd be giving on charging points for new homes, or local pick-up and drop-off points by cargo bikes, electric cargo bikes, or whatever. I mean, absolutely we need a fund. And this is what I was, just to reiterate this point at the start that I was making, the transport economy is 10 times what the government funds. And the thing is, if we want to lever those resources into a national mission for climate change targets, we absolutely have to make sure that every government pound buys 9 more from the private sector. And that's what partnering with all of the people that can do that stuff is. I'm saying one housing development I've just been involved in. We're actually today building a development that will lock in at least £20 million per year of car-dependent spending by the households that live in those houses. I mean, that's the scale of money. So these relatively small commitments of government money when we get the decisions wrong. So I mean, a lot of it's back to like Ewan and his colleagues in local government. Why is it so hard for them to when giving planning permission for, say, new homes or whatever? New Homes are Scotland's biggest road builder, by the way. Why is it so difficult to actually factor in with the people doing the development a net zero philosophy, a net zero strategy to what we do? And frankly, what we see in the plan that Scottish Government have given us here, saying things like, oh, we'll go and have a chat about how we improve this. You know, we've learned a lot in the last 30 years since the original planning policy guidance, NPPG 17 and all this stuff. We've learned a lot about how to do these things. Why are we not doing them? And I think this is my point, is that actually, instead of trying to treat all this as if this is a great new idea, we're going to have zero carbon transport, we've actually been working hard. And if we did more of the things that worked over the last 30 years, we'd be on the right road to the future. And that's from taking charging points to e-bikes to everything. So absolutely, Emma, spot on, right question. Let's develop it and let's start thinking about what funds we need to enable and lever the people and businesses of Scotland to start spending their money to deliver on this mission.
And Derek, you almost got e-bikes in there at the end, so that was fine. So Emma, you want a supplementary?
Yep. Just thanks, convener. Just a quick supplementary for John about e-bikes, and if we are going to support e-bike uptake, local authorities do need to have safe, secure lockers so you can park them in the town centre safely, and also charging points as well. So I'm just proposing that to John, assuming that that is what we would need to do as well.
John, you can answer yes or no to that, I'm sure.
Yes, my answer would be yes, and it's all about good quality infrastructure. And infrastructure extends not just to paths, segregated lanes, but to, as you said, Emma, safe places to store your bike so you're confident it'll be there when you come back. What I can say, my colleagues in the Energy Savings Trust who run the grant scheme for electric bikes, is they're also at capacity. They've spent their budget, you know, so that the demand is there. The demand is there, and e-bikes are brilliant, and I hope the committee have all had a chance to use one because they're fantastic.
Thank you very much, John. And thanks, Emma. We're going to push on to Colin's got some questions. And I just say at this stage that Andy Jefferson sat very quietly in the background. Your time will come. You are not forgotten, but it is not yet. So, Colin, it's you with your question now. Colin Smith.
Thank you, convener, and good morning to the panel. I'm pleased that Gillian and Derek bravely tried to move the discussion onto prevention rather than just cure and reducing the need to travel, not just what punishments or carrots we use on those forced to travel into congested cities, because frankly that's where we create all the jobs. I have to say my constituents would love nothing more than have a job locally than having to travel into Edinburgh or Glasgow for hours every day for that job. But sticking to the script, convener, on modes of travel, can I come to the issue specifically of rail? And my question is initially aimed at Mark Gaynor from the Rail Delivery Group. The draft climate change plan update has one rail-related policy to decarbonise our rail services by 2035. A key aspect of this is electrification. Can I ask, does the rail industry have the capacity to deliver those electrification plans, which don't appear at this stage to have any costings?
Mark.
Thank you, Colin. The Transport Scotland obviously has published a outlined railway decarbonisation action plan, which when you look at electrification suggests the need to electrify, I think it's 130 kilometres of track each year. In itself, I think that is deliverable. But I think what my supply chain colleagues would say is, show us the money, sort of show us the sort of the financial commitment to that, and then we can actually gear up and deliver it. I think what I would also say though is that sort of south of the border, similar plans are being developed, and we're expecting to see, I think the Department for Transport publish a transport decarb plan in the spring, and that may say something else about rail electrification. And then I think it would make sense to look at those plans in the round and what they mean for the supply chain. What the supply chain has said, if you give us a steady long-term electrification plan that's committed and funded, we can gear up and deliver it efficiently. Problems we've had in the past, not so much in Scotland where there's been steady progress on electrification, but elsewhere, Great Western electrification between sort of London and Wales, that sort of came out of nowhere. A real example, a good example, bad example of boom and bust, and that caused a lot of problems for the supply chain to deliver against. So I think my general view would be ensure it's a steady pipeline, it's funded, it's predictable, and it delivers the confidence that the supply chain needs, and the supply chain can gear up and deliver it cost efficiently.
Yeah. I mean, some areas on the electrification plan itself are obviously excluded. I mean, services southwest of Girvan, for example, and they'll have to rely on battery or hydrogen rolling stock. I mean, are there any costs or practical barriers to those alternatives? And is there a concern that using that type of alternative doesn't show the same level of long-term commitment to those particular routes? And again, the question is really for Mark.
Go for it, Mark. Yeah.
Just out of mute. Yeah. So there are a range of different technologies with different costs and capability associated with them. Generally speaking, it's sort of trade-offs between if you've got a relatively intensively used service, sort of more mainline intercity type service, then electrification, you can get a good business case for it. The costs are offset by all the savings you can get. For more lightly used routes, it's much harder to make that case for full-blown electrification because of the cost of the infrastructure, which means that other technologies such as battery or hydrogen fuel cell might be more cost effective. But what I would say is that if we get really good at electrifying and we get the costs down, then I think that means we can do more electrification rather than less. But also, if there is a need to rely on some of these other technologies, they are developing rapidly. We're seeing improvements in battery performance. We're seeing sort of costs come down and capability going up. So it's not always the case that these are sort of, if you like, second-rate solutions. That they may very well have a really good capability that is fit for purpose for the sorts of routes that are being suggested through, for example, Transport Scotland's Rail Decarbonisation Action Plan.
So just realistically, when can we see battery operated and hydrogen operated trains being used on a regular basis in Scotland's railways?
So the technologies are reasonably well advanced. There are examples, for example, in Germany of hydrogen fuel cells being used in passenger service, and there are providers and manufacturers in the UK developing the technology. So it's not a case of these need to be developed and trialled in a huge way. I think it's more about, if the order is there, the supply chain is ready to step up and deliver. So
and just finally for Marco, I appreciate that others will want to come in on the back of rail, but particularly this question here, how important will new or reinstated railways be to supporting a switch from road to rail? We've seen, for example, a campaign for the extension of the Borders rail line, or the reopening of the Dumfries to Stranraer line. There are numerous examples that would make a huge difference to areas. How important is reinstating those railways to switching from road to rail?
Well, I think,
Mark, hold on, Mark. Sorry, that's for you. Just to warn off Colin, I'm going to bring him in after you. So, Mark, off you go.
So I think the railway can play a really valuable role in sort of connecting communities and expanding the railway like that. I think if it's convenient, easy to use, accessible, inclusive, then absolutely it could play a really important role in weaning people off the car. And I think, as others have said, I think integrating railway, thinking about sort of rail expansion into more general discussions about planning is really important, so that we don't end up developing communities that are reliant on car travel from the very start. Ensuring that we're thinking about rail very early on in sort of planning, I think is really, really important.
Okay, Colin, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, briefly on both questions that Colin's raised. So firstly on are the plans deliverable? So we've welcomed the Transport Scotland plans here. We have, however, argued that 2035 may be too late. That should be being brought forward to 2030. 3/4 of Scotland's diesel trains will be life expired by about 2030. So we think there's questions there as to whether the plan needs to be brought forward somewhat. We noticed that in the plan there is a reference to 2032 in one of the diagrams. So whether Transport Scotland are thinking they give some movement there, perhaps. In terms of reinstated railways, absolutely, we've supported the campaign for the Leavenmouth Rail campaign, for the Leavenmouth Rail to be reinstated, and it's great to see that is happening now. I would say there are other deserving cases. I think there should be, for example, the Buchan line to Fraserburgh and Peterhead need to be looked at. Certainly alongside if more cash is going to go into expanding the A90 up to those, I think we really need to be looking at rail at the same time. And the one new rail line that we really think could transform journey times across the intercity network is reinstating a direct line between Perth and Edinburgh. That would reduce journey times there, according to Transport Scotland's figures in the 2009 STPR, of 45 minutes, and that would really improve journey times heading towards Perth and on to Inverness. So there's the aspirations we would raise in terms of rail line reinstatement.
Okay, I'm going to bring Mags in just to talk about logistics and railways. I think it's a good opportunity here to cover that.
Yep, thank you very much, convener. So yes, electrification is clearly the path to net zero for the rail sector, we believe. And when we start talking about modal shift, so from road to rail, there are a couple of really good examples in Scotland that recently have been achieved. We're involved with the Scotland Freight Joint Board meetings with Network Rail. So just to give you an idea of those, there was the timber trial with Victor Rail Freight, which was up near Inverness, where they do a significant number of trucks off the road. It admittedly was a short route. It's from Caithness to Dalcross, but they secured loading points at Inverness to allow the timber to be moved onto the railway. Another really big success story is the addition of a siding at the Highland Spring plant in Blackford. That obviously was a significant amount of investment, and it has been successful. Again, that will take a number of HGVs off the roads. Couple of points to make. Capacity is the biggest issue for getting additional freight routes on across the network, across the UK, but particularly in Scotland. And I think it's also important to remember that unlike passenger rail sector, where it's government procured rolling stock, the rail freight stock is owned and operated by private sector companies. And so obviously they're looking for direction from government to say, right, yes, we're going to invest in electric stock. Clearly significant cost implications to that. But yet there is an opportunity for, in some cases, particularly heavy goods that aren't time sensitive, to be put onto the back of rail. Final point to make is that don't think of it being road or rail. The two very much work together. So you have to have access to the site where the train can be loaded, and that has to be suitable for HGVs. And it's very much a case of the two modes working together as the future, I think, of freight. Hope that's helpful.
Okay, and there's various comments that, Colin, you've got a rail line, but you're right, you can't mention them all. Briefly, 1-2 words. Do you want to mention the railway line? And then I'm going to go on to Angus MacDonald. Colin, your one opportunity.
The reopening of the passenger rail services from Grangemouth to Falkirk, and yes, absolutely, we'd support that. Recently we also responded to the Union Connectivity Review and said that you should be looking at reinstating rail services to Cairnryan. Why not, if you're looking at dualling the A75, why are you not reinstating the rail line from Carlisle to Grandar and Cairnryan? So yeah, we could go on listing rail aspirations. I saw the Greens last week had plans for a rail tunnel under the Forth, so I think you're running short of time, so I'll shut up at that point.
I think you stretched your one thing. So we're going to go to Angus MacDonald next, and I'm ignoring you, Colin, at the moment. So Angus, to you, and I think that Andy's time has come. So Angus.
Indeed, thanks, convener. Both I and Andy Jefferson have been waiting patiently to get to the issue of aviation. So we know that the CCPU included one aviation-related policy outcome, which was, and I quote, "We will work to decarbonise scheduled flights within Scotland by 2040. Now, we know that in 2018, there was only 5% of Scottish Air passengers flew between two Scottish airports. So, given that these are relatively short flights, often made using smaller aircraft, they're likely to account for less than 5% of the Scottish aviation emissions. So, if I could ask, basically, the first strand of my question, what impact do you expect decarbonising scheduled flights within Scotland will have on overall Scottish aviation emissions? And that, of course, is to Andy.
So, good morning, everybody. I'm patiently waiting, still here, but no, great to be with you all. So I think just a couple of points. Sustainable aviation, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is a UK coalition of the UK aviation industry. So across all the parts of that industry, from the aerospace manufacturers through to the airlines, airports, and air traffic control providers. Specifically to your question, Angus, the impact of aviation emissions on those flights in Scotland can be dramatically cut. We developed a plan which we published in February last year that led to a commitment from the industry to deliver the net zero aviation by 2050 at least. And within that, there's a sort of two key areas we're looking at. One is how do we switch to new technology aircraft, so the hydrogen aircraft and electric aircraft. And there's some exciting, I think, opportunities for the Highland and Island flights across Scotland in that space. And I know airlines like Loganair are talking with innovators and how they're going to look to phase those new aircraft in. The challenge with that is, I think the earliest we're going to see them is sort of 2030s. So the challenge in the interim is what else can we do? And one of the areas is how we can change the fuel used on the aircraft from a fossil-based fuel to a much more sustainable-based fuel. And you'll have seen the one-page infographic in the evidence pack with this meeting. And one thing we think actually there's knock-on opportunities for broader economic benefits to Scotland. So we're doing some work across the industry looking at how we can use waste that currently goes to landfill that can't be recycled, and using that to turn into jet fuel. There's also opportunities from looking at agricultural wastes and wastes from forestry operations and using that waste and turning that into jet fuel. And then in the longer run, we are looking at how we can take and progress that from, instead of using waste products to make fuel, in terms of moving it to what we call a power to liquid solution, where you would use renewable energy linked with hydrogen production to create jet fuel. So you can produce jet fuel at that point on zero carbon. So my view is, yes, we're a relatively small part from aviation at the moment to carbon. It's likely to grow if we don't do anything, though, because as we've heard, there is decarbonisation across other parts of the economy in different sectors. So the key thing for aviation is to not become the problem child of the future. So hopefully that helps answer your question, Angus.
Okay, yeah, that is helpful, and certainly some exciting developments. We're also aware that the French government has set Air France a target of having emissions measured by passenger kilometre from domestic flights by 2024 and international flights by 2030. Now, many domestic routes will be replaced by rail travel. So is this an approach that the UK and or the Scottish Government should be taking, or is partial state ownership a requirement for such action?
I think from the industry's point of view, no solutions are off the table. Everything's important to be explored at the moment. I think the challenge the industry's got clearly with the impacts of the COVID pandemic, we're looking at 90% reduction in normal business, and therefore a lot of loss of money, cash flow effectively across the aviation industry. And also a lot of the solutions around decarbonising aviation are in the innovation space with innovators that are relatively early stage, so we'll need an element of help to bring that solution into a commercial arena and to scale up those opportunities, be that sustainable fuels or new aircraft technologies. So I think it's one to explore. I think the issue with targets is how do we do a target in a way that doesn't end up creating unexpected consequences, and an example of that would be if we were to insist on a use of sustainable fuel or a cost on flights in Scotland. Effectively, what you'd be doing is penalising people who wish to fly in Scotland compared to people who don't fly elsewhere. And that might create a situation where they choose to drive down to somewhere in England or elsewhere, so you might not necessarily be solving the problem. So really welcome the opportunity to talk through ideas like this with you and others. But we need to do that in a smart way.
Okay, that would be helpful, convener. I don't know if you want to open out, convener, to any others who might want to comment.
I'm nervous about time, Angus. I've got 2 more members to get in. So if you're happy with those answers, Colin, do you want to come in very briefly, Colin? Very briefly.
It's just very briefly, just referring to Angus's first statement that the proposals in the plan only refers to 5% of flights, and so it completely omits reference to flights from, let's say, Edinburgh to London, Glasgow to London, which are both within the top 10 pair flight corridors in Western Europe. I really think that there needs to be action by the Scottish Government to instruct public bodies that they should not be flying from Edinburgh to London or Glasgow to London, except in very exceptional circumstances. I think that's the way that you can really drive down emissions from the aviation sector.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure business. Sorry, you want to stop all flights between Edinburgh and Glasgow to London?
Didn't say all flights, but I said that the Scottish Government could be giving an instruction to the public bodies to stop flying from Edinburgh to London and Glasgow to London, where there is competitive rail services there which provide much lower emissions, a quarter of emissions, and better productivity benefits because people can work on trains the way they can't work on airplanes. So I think that is something that should be inserted into the plan. It's not sufficient for the government to say that it's only responsible for flights within Scotland if that is only 5% of all flights.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, you've also been waiting very patiently. Now is your moment.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the great build-up. Convener, good morning to the panel. We touched on this before, and it's really, I think, a question for Mag Simpson. It was regards to the logistics industry, and obviously really basically to find out what it's doing to reduce emissions from HGVs before the proposed 2035 target for all new HGVs to be zero emission.
Mags, do you want to head off on that?
Just to give you an update, Euro 6 is the cleanest version of a diesel truck that you can get, and here, so by end of expect 70% of the fleet as across the UK to be Euro 6. Now, Euro 6 is significantly the cleanest truck you're ever going to get from a diesel point of view, and I can get you specific information on that if you would like it. The issue that we've got regarding what a ultra low emission truck or an ultra low emission vehicle from an HGV point of view is that there is significant uncertainty right now at this precise moment in time over which fuel is going to be the most efficient. So I actually posed this to, as I mentioned earlier, to our Freight Council recently. So I look after the Freight Council in Scotland and then the 3 in the north of England. Some of LNG or CNG vehicles, so gas vehicles, but they are looking at a small percentage of their fleet to see what, productivity, how much it costs to run them, etc., etc. Is that it's still a fossil fuel, and it's very much considered by the industry at the moment as a bit of a stepping stone. As I alluded to, there are lots of our members looking at electric, but that is very much the solution from sort of 3 maybe up to a maximum of 4.2 tonnes. But as soon as you start getting any heavier than that, the weight of the battery that you would need just completely destroys the payload, so it completely nullifies the solution. There's also some chat around hydrogen, but hydrogen, and I think I would encourage everybody on the panel to be aware of this, is that hydrogen seems to be a solution in pockets of the country. What we need is a UK approach to HG. Can't expect the industry who is running, they tend to be national operations, they're running up and down the length and breadth of the country. They need some certainty on regards infrastructure, they need some certainty regards funding and support, because these vehicles are all significantly more expensive than the current vehicle that they will be running. So nobody's going to invest in a huge way until they're absolutely certain that that is going to be the fuel of the future, if that makes sense. So there's lots, the industry as a whole absolutely recognises its part to play, it has a part to play, they want to do this, but they need some certainty regards what the future is going to be, which fuel it's going to be that everybody uses. They need some certainty regards a policy framework around funding that can be made available to them, whether that's to encourage them to use a certain type of fuel, or whether it's for capital. There's such a broad range of products and such a broad range of vehicles, different types of vehicles, specialist vehicles, so that there's so many elements to this. There is no one-fits-all solution. I think it's important to point out.
Thanks very much. I mean, you said earlier that... Oops.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say, Jamie, could you come back in with one more question, and because we are up against the clock on timing-wise. So one more question from you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Convener. I'll make it very quick. I mean, it was really, Mags, you said that that Scotland was at the end of the supply chain, and of course the Highlands and Islands will be even more so, and will have its own difficulties. So I'm just wondering whether there's a solution for the Highlands and Islands, or whether we're going to see even greater kind of issues moving to kind of for lower or zero emission vehicles supplying in and out of the Highlands and Islands.
Mags, that's you again, I think.
Sorry, I just waited for the microphone to be unmuted. Yes, I completely agree. We don't want to cut off the Highlands any more than they potentially are at the moment. As I alluded to earlier, road is very much the main route to getting product up to the north of Scotland, and then obviously followed quickly by the ferries. I know there's a lot of work going on with ferries, looking at hybrid solutions, hydrogen and electric. So as I say, there will be no one fits all, but we must be very careful that no part of Scotland's community, or indeed Scotland as a whole, is cut off from the rest of the UK. So the infrastructure needs to be available all the way up the length and breadth of the country.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. And now questions from the Deputy Convener, Maureen. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. We know that the emissions from light goods vehicles have almost doubled since 1990, and that's largely been due to the growth of online shopping. Now, it seems as if some members of the panel are hoping that that growth will continue, so that people who live in rural areas work from home, get their shopping delivered, and do their leisure from home, or stop their leisure and don't go to tourist destinations. So what can the industry do to reduce emissions from this growing sector?
Who would you like to ask that to?
Derek Haldane may be best to start this conversation.
Derek. No, Derek, hold on, Derek. We've missed your pearls of wisdom. You were still muted. You're now unmuted. Off you go.
Yeah, sorry, I was just clarifying with Maureen the sector specifically that that we're talking about being
the white van man delivery.
Yeah, yes, yeah. Right, so not like retail or anything like this. So just so we're thinking about the white van. A means of facilitating small business, moving loads around as much as moving to customers or whatever. I mean, there's different mechanisms for how we fund what we're on. I mean, the vans themselves are way ahead of the trucks. I mean, we've been looking at the heavy goods as Mags says. We're very much, is it going to be hydrogen? Is it going to be like catenary systems, like the Siemens systems, like the A9 or whatever in a few years, and then on battery for the final 40 miles? But vans are going to be more like cars, that yes, we're going to get a decent enough range out of them that they won't need to be on the catenary systems on the long distance motorways and trunk roads, and probably don't need the cost of hydrogen, the cost premium of hydrogen. So we can electrify most of that. But the single biggest thing we can do in the white vans is the local pickup drop-off points. So virtually every delivery, I think we've discussed this already with the cargo bikes and everything and picking that up, that growing an industry within local communities of virtually everything going to a local community hub or hubs, as we're seeing with Collect Plus and all these companies and like this is where the real low-hanging fruit is on carbon emissions, is this last mile, where the vans are doing all the wasted mileage on small numbers of parcels to individual houses, when actually if the bigger vehicle was doing the delivery to a hub, and that's really efficient because they can drop off 100 parcels at once, and then the cargo bike can do the final mile, or even people walking in themselves or whatever. So the low hanging fruit is in that space there on this whole on the white van market, as it were. Do that. So yes, technology. Yes, it's predominantly electric. The technology's there. Let's go and do more of it. Indeed, I say companies like Amazon. That's why they're making such heavy investments in electric vans. But in terms of the actual efficiency of the delivery, there's low-hanging fruit there as well.
So, I mean, if Amazon's adverts are to be believed, yes, they are investing in low-carbon vehicles and electric vehicles, but they're just one part of that sector. How do we get the others? And the hubs that you were talking about, Derek, I mean, how does government have a role in incentivizing these hubs so that, you know, I don't know, would you have a hub in the 20-minute zone or the 20-minute idea, and then vans take all the goods from different companies that people have ordered and take them out? Is that how you envisage that working?
I mean, it's back to what I've been saying about people and businesses. The right incentives in place for everybody to do the right thing. I really don't think thresholds are a good idea. I know that 20 minutes is a nice, it rings and it illustrates the concept of having everybody within walking distance. But, you know, Paris has gone 15 minutes, whatever. And the general academic consensus is whatever threshold you set is wrong and leads to more counterintuitive things happening, unintended consequences happening. What we want is to take everybody from where they are this year and make it better next year. And then we can measure that. We know how long it takes for every household in the country to walk to a grocer. And we can actually make sure that all the households in Scotland next year, that's gone down. And if we deliver incrementally and give everyone the right incentives and grants, it's those missing grants and those missing incentives, I think, are the single biggest hole in this plan. The plan just doesn't deal with the population. It assumes that decisions will be made. I mean, John Lauder might be brilliant at making decisions on which, say, active travel networks to fund from Sustrans, but it'll never be as good as the collective will of the Scottish people investing in all the ways that they have the capability to do so. So I think that's the point, is how do we enable more people to do more stuff, and including the white van purchasers?
Okay, I'm really sorry, Maureen, to draw it to a close there, but actually probably drawing it to a close with a question that we don't have an answer for will stimulate further thought. So at this stage, I am going to have to say that is going to be the end of this session. I'd like to thank all our witnesses. I apologise for those that didn't get to come in when they wanted to. I apologise to those who had to wait longer than they wanted to. And I apologise for those people that don't think they had a fair hearing. Quite difficult with 9 witnesses, but we've enjoyed our session. We've learned a huge amount. So thank you very much. I am now going to suspend the meeting for 5 minutes to allow this group of witnesses to leave and our next lot of witnesses to join. So the meeting is now suspended. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and welcome back to this meeting of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. And I'd like to move now to the second item on our agenda, which is the SIFT of one Brexit-related SSI as detailed on the agenda. Now, the Scottish Government has allocated the negative procedure to this SSI. Is the committee agreed that it is content with the parliamentary procedure allocated to the instrument by the Scottish Government? If anyone has any comments, please put them in the chat bar. I'm seeing nothing at the moment. Therefore, I'm assuming that's agreed. So we will therefore move on to agenda item 3, which is the consideration of one affirmative instrument as detailed on the agenda. Now, the committee will take evidence on the agricultural holdings relinquishment and assignation application to Relevant Partnership Scotland Regulations 2020. The motion seeking the approval of the affirmative instrument will be considered at item 4. Now, we have not received any representations on this instrument, but I would welcome from the Scottish Government Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy and Tourism, James Muldoon, the Head of Agricultural Support Policy Division of the Scottish Government. John Martin, I believe, is joining us, who is a Senior Policy Advisor from the Scottish Government, and Kirsty Slee, who is a lawyer for the Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretary, would you like to make a brief opening statement? And just to say, Cabinet Secretary, when you have, I am going to go to members and ask them if they want to declare any relevant interests before asking you any questions. Cabinet Secretary.
Good morning, Convener. I'd like to thank the committee for taking the time to consider these important regulations and giving me the opportunity to address members this morning. The draft Agricultural Holdings Relinquishment and Assignation application to Relevant Partnership Scotland Regs 2021 were laid using the powers conferred in the Agricultural Holdings Scotland Act 2003 as amended by the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016. Convener, Part 3A enables secure 1991 Act tenant farmers without successors to seek to relinquish their tenancy to the landlord for value, where the landlord cannot or does not want to take the tenancy back in hand, to assign that tenancy for value to a new entrant or person progressing in farming. These regulations modify Part 3A in its application to limited partnership tenancies. The effect of this is to allow eligible tenant farmers to seek to relinquish their tenancy, but not to assign it if the landlord declines to accept notice of relinquishment. The Scottish Government consider this approach to provide a fair balance to the rights of both parties within the lease in those tenancies where the limited partnership structure gives rise to a different set of rights and considerations on the part of the landlord and their tenants. These regulations, along with the wider relinquishment and assignation regulations, will provide the mechanism and support for older eligible tenant farmers who wish to relinquish their secure 1991 Act agricultural tenancies and retire out of agriculture to have better clarity and an easier to use process. Convener, in conclusion, my officials and I are happy to answer questions that committee members may have.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And before I go to those questions, I am going to ask members if they want to make any declarations of interest. I am going to make a declaration of an interest that I'm a member of a farming partnership in Murray. I was going to go to Peter Chapman, followed by Stuart Stevenson, followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson. Peter.
Indeed, Convener, I would like to declare that I am a member of a farming partnership in Aberdeenshire. Thank you.
Okay, Stuart Stevenson.
I am the joint owner of a very small registered agricultural holding and I derive no income from it.
Thank you. And Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you, Convener. It was just to mention that I am a member of a farming partnership in Orkney and a member of agricultural groups including NFUS and Scottish Land and Estates.
Thank you very much. I don't see anyone else has asked any questions. Sorry, wanted to declare any interest. Cabinet Secretary, could I start off by asking you a question myself, please? Could you just clarify on farming partnerships which rely on a 91 agricultural tenancy? If the general partner wants to resign, they are not being given under this legislation any right to assign their tenancy, are they? Because that is specifically excluded from partnerships. Is that understanding correct, Cabinet Secretary?
If I just may preface my answer with one caveat, Convener, that if I make any slip in the legal point of view, I would ask I don't often do this, I don't think I've done this before, but this is a highly legally complex issue which I've spent 2 hours this morning in researching. So if I make any slip, please, my officials should intervene. But I think I'm reasonably well prepared. The answer to your question is that is correct. Limited partnerships, where, as I'm sure you well know, a method of allowing tenants and farmers to enter into an agreement without conferring the security that secure tenancies provide. And that, I think, was the purpose of limited partnerships in effect. From the landlord's point of view, it was attractive, less so from the tenants, but nonetheless it was deployed. And because it is a different beast from a secure tenancy, where security of tenure applies, the landlord's rights are actually greater. And for that reason, the advice that we received, and of course I can't reveal legal advice, but broadly speaking, the approach that we've determined to take, which steers a course in accordance with the law, is that there needs to be a balancing of the interests of the tenants and the landlords under the limited partnership arrangement. And it was felt that the relinquishment provisions were satisfactory and ECHR compliant. But had we extended the assignation rights, if I could term them thus, in respect of passage to a new entrant or someone that wants to progress in agriculture, in farming, that would have perhaps gone too far in that balance, Convener, in making a judgment with regard to the provisions of the ECHR. And I must stress, these are very important provisions. They're very important per se because they protect the rights of property owners, but they also provide for the governments to balance the interests of that with public policy in general. So by definition, it's a balancing act. And our judgment, after lengthy and painstaking advice, was that this was the fair approach and the correct approach, and one which struck a balance which was appropriate in the particular circumstances. As I say, Convener, I hope I've framed that in a way that is correct and not inaccurate, but I do say if my officials feel they need to add anything, then because this is a highly legalistic issue, then I actually would think it might be helpful if they had an opportunity now so to do, in case I have failed the legal exam, since the last one I took was in 1976.
Well, Kirsty hasn't asked to come in, but I'm very happy to bring her in just to correct you if you're failing on your legal points. She's not looking very keen to do that. Kirsty.
No, I have nothing to add. Thank you. That's a comprehensive summary of the approach that's been taken. So I'm happy to leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Kirsty, and thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That clarifies that. I have one further question, and then I think there are some other questions. Is when on the assignation of a tenancy, what usually happens is the WAGO compensation is passed from is paid to the outgoing tenant by the incoming tenant, and I wondered, in your consideration of this instrument, is whether you think it will be detrimental to new entrants, or whether you think it will be neutral, because we all want to see more entrants coming in to take on tenancies where that's possible. Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I make the same caveat as before, but I believe that it will be neutral, and the provisions whereby an assignation provision will be available to a new entrant or those that wish to progress in farming is really a measure that I think is long overdue, and it's separate from the WAGO issues, which are freestanding. So, obviously, convener, as members will know, the position of a new entrant or the position of a new farmer is such that there will be a number of financial demands to set up any new business of quite substantial nature in some types of farming, where the capital required to get stock, buildings, and so on is substantial. So I don't suggest that anything is straightforward about this, but because I think you're really hinting at the financial position of a new entrant or someone who would be able to avail themselves of these assignation provisions. There are financial challenges facing anyone that wants to come into farming starting afresh. I think most of the new entrants actually are not really starting afresh. They probably worked as fencing contractors. Maybe they've done a bit of farming in their own, contract farming. In other words, they've learned the ropes, they've done their apprenticeship, they know what they're doing, and they've decided to move up into the next level. But nonetheless, this assignation provision, which has been described as a ladder, I think, a way in for new entrants by the Scottish Tenant Farmers Association, who have campaigned for this for a very long time, and with whom we've closely worked, have warmly welcomed this measure. And of course, the last thing I'll say is that very helpful to the older farmer who's perhaps on the wrong side, sadly, like myself, of the age of 60, and perhaps not even in possession of their own original hips, and wanting to find a way to be serious to make their life a little less demanding, as farming, of course, active farming is.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I've got some committee members who will who want to answer some questions. So first of all, I've got Maureen Watt, and then I've got Angus MacDonald. So Maureen.
Thank you, convener. Yeah, this has obviously been very complicated, and I think been 4 years in the making. And unfortunately, in that time, there have been a number of retiring tenants with landlords who've been unwilling to take part in informal negotiations and who've been unable to wait for this legislation and have had to leave their tenancies with reduced WAGO compensation. I wonder if Cabinet Secretary, how many people have been involved in this and how many have been holding on for this new legislation. So, will this legislation be made use of very soon by a significant number of people?
Cabinet Secretary.
Several questions there. I believe that there are many people waiting to avail themselves of this, and who have been for some time. I'm aware also, and the STFA press release states this, the one that was issued recently, that there may be others who would like to have availed themselves but weren't able to. I think I would say, convener, that I think the most recent survey of opinion shows that most landlords and tenants get on quite well and are satisfied with the relationships. And that's very much welcome. 80 or 90%, I think, 90 in the case of landlords, 80 in that kind of thing. But, those 10, 20%, I do hope that it is possible for landlords and tenants voluntarily, by negotiation, discussion and agreement, to reach an accommodation as to all important matters. Of course, that's the case, but there are always going to be a number that don't. And I regret that, but it is a fact. The other point I want to make in response to Ms. Watt's question is that this has taken a long time, perhaps too long. I accept that. I'm responsible ultimately as the Minister. But the point I want to make is this, convener. I was around in the Parliament when we passed the 2003 Act. We did so with good intentions. But an important measure in that Act was adjudged to be illegal by the courts. I think it was a case of Salveson v. Riddle, if I remember correctly. And that judgment found that we breached, the government breached, but, collectively we as a committee passed a law which was proved to be ultra vires because it contravened the ECHR, the first protocol of Article 1 of the first protocol thereto. Now, that's very much in my mind. Obviously, as the Minister, I don't want to be the person who passed legislation that is open to challenge, far less see that it is actually challenged. And because the ECHR is a very, very important document which protects legal rights of individuals, including property owners, we have to proceed with care. And that, convener, in essence, is why it has taken this length of time, because although I can't divulge legal advice, I can absolutely assure you that lawyers have worked with others, civil servants, painstakingly in order to try to strike the right balance and have discussions with the various stakeholders as they have had in order to deliver a piece of legislation that will help a vast number of people in Scotland. And that frankly is something I'm pleased to be able to explain as to why it's taken longer than I would have liked to arrive here. But having arrived here, I'm very confident that this legislation will unlock opportunities for young people to enter farming, and that must surely be a good thing, as well as allowing those who wish to retire.
Thank you. Now, Cabinet Secretary, there are a list now of committee members. So Angus MacDonald, followed by Peter Chapman. Angus.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Just to follow up on the Cabinet Secretary's comments there, having served on the former Iraqi committee in the previous session of Parliament and having taken extensive evidence on these issues during our scrutiny of the Land Reform Bill in 2015 and 2016, I'm certainly delighted to see these SSIs before us today. So it's clear that the approach encourages continuation of tenant farming and social cohesion in rural areas. And as the Cabinet Secretary has just mentioned, it'll be particularly beneficial to older tenant farmers who wish to retire out of agriculture. But crucially, it also supports retention of younger people and farming families, and it also assists in removing barriers for new entrants, as has already been mentioned. So all in all, a very welcome development for both landlords and tenants, as it creates a greater level of confidence all around. So more a comment than a question, Convener. Thank you.
A comment, I would agree. So no answer required there, Cabinet Secretary. Peter Chapman, I think you have a question, hopefully not a statement.
I do have a question. I would just like to say I'm pleased to hear that the Cabinet Secretary does believe that this will unlock a lot of new tenancies for new folk to get involved in agriculture. I've said for many, many years that the tenancy sector hasn't been working as it should in Scotland, and hopefully this will do that. My question is, if the landlord decides to take back the tenancy, can the Cabinet Secretary explain what the process is to assign that value to that tenancy? And the flip side of that, if the landlord doesn't take back the tenancy, is there a similar method to calculate the value of that tenancy for a new person coming in, or is that just a subject to market forces? Two questions there, Convener.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, again, I'll start off with the initial original caveat, but my understanding is that, first of all, the tenant who is kind of outgoing or wishes to be outgoing offers relinquishment to the landlord, and if the landlord doesn't wish relinquishment, then the assignation procedure kicks in and can take place, and then the assignation is a matter between the existing tenant and the prospective assignee. As to the issue about market value and the valuation of this is a complex area. It's one I've asked about and I've had advice about, obviously. There is a lot of work been done here by all parties, and discussions took place with stakeholders I think early in 2019 and subsequently. The Tenant Farmers Commissioner, Bob McIntosh, is also going to provide Mr. Chapman guidance, and I think that has been welcomed by, I saw SLE welcome that, and I think all parties will welcome it. This is not new. Land agents are already involved in this work, in the kind of valuation of the particular interest that has been assigned. And I did read earlier the formula for that, but I'm not sure it would serve any particular purpose of me just reading out a fairly arid, a fairly kind of lawyerly approach. But I do think that my understanding is that the farming community are generally familiar with what's involved, are ready and willing to activate it, and the Tenant Farmers Commissioner is a welcome adjunct to the system and plays a positive, constructive, collaborative role in encouraging all parties to make the new system work. I hope that's an answer to Mr. Chapman's question. If it's not, and it's insufficient, then I would ask my officials, because it is a slightly technical question, convener, a series of questions, to add something. I don't know whether it would be Mr. Martin, Mr. Slee, or Mr. Muldoon.
I'm very happy to bring them in, but I'm not sure that reading out the list of how you value away-going tenancy would be of huge benefit. Having done it before, it's quite formulaic. But yes. Cabinet Secretary, if any of them would like to come in, I'm not seeing anyone. Everyone looking the other way. It's always a good thing to do. Peter, does that answer your question?
Well, not quite. I mean, I think there's a formula if the landlord wants to take back the tenancy, but I was really wondering if the landlord doesn't wish to do that, how the valuation is decided between the new tenant coming in and the tenant relinquishing. Is that just subject to market forces, or how is that valuation going to be done? Is my question really.
Well, it would be a matter for consensual agreement between the two parties, the outgoing and the incoming tenant. It would be for the two parties to negotiate with the benefit of presumably some advice and the reference to guidance which will be forthcoming from the Tenant Farmers Commission. I mean, in that respect, Mr. Chapman, I mean, I guess it would be like any property transaction, essentially a matter for the parties, but in this case with quite a considerable statutory overlay helping to guide the parties as to how that valuation should be calculated, because, you know, it's a different species, it's a different beast. This, in terms of a property right, it's quite easy, if you like, to conceptually to understand the value of land sold with vacant possession. That's the property market in Scotland. But the agricultural holdings provisions, given that they impose the rights of security, obviously mean that the value of land with a secure tenant is different, because the landlord is not able to enjoy the fruits of possession, I think is the legal phrase that I'm dredging from the memory banks in the 70s and 80s. And therefore it is essentially a matter, I think, Mr. Chapman, for the two parties. But I do think that there is a substantial amount of support that they will have in terms of, obviously, advice that they can access from agents, but also from the Tenant Farmers Commissioner and existing practice, because this is not, as I said, new before. And indeed, many parties have already come to an agreement. I think just waiting on, you know, in some cases, waiting on this act to this statutory instrument to come into force. So I think, you know, the key thing, I think, in all these things is that we have willing parties. You know, going into a contract, parties must be, in general terms, willing to both benefit therefrom. That's the idea of contracts in the free market, something I imagine Mr. Chapman supports.
Okay, and we are going to move on to the next question, which is from Emma Harper. I think you have a brief follow-up.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I know that bringing these regulations forward has been welcomed, and I've got one particular constituent that I've been working with over the years, and he has been quite happy that these regulations are now coming forward, and he already has a meeting set up with his landlord. And I'm sure that the landlords and the tenants are all, and the land agents are very knowledgeable about the regulations already. So it's just a quick question related. Who's responsible then for communicating with the landlords and the agents and the tenants that we have the regulations now in place? And is that something that the Land Commission does as far as communicating?
Well, I think that in answer to Emma Harper's question, the communication is done primarily by ourselves to the specialist farming press, who cover these matters in a great deal of detail and report things very accurately. So I think the likes of the Scottish Farmer will, I'm quite sure, report this very substantially. But also the representative bodies, the NFUS, SLE, STFA, who have been leading the campaign on this for many, many, many years, will of course immediately inform their membership that the provisions have been passed by Parliament. And I think the jungle drums beat quite loudly in farming circles. News travels fast. Good news travels pretty fast, bad news even faster probably. But I do think that this good news will be communicated and promulgated to everybody that is likely to wish to be affected. But it's a fair point, and I will make sure, in the light of the question, that we take pains to make sure that we get our message across to all. Thank you.
Okay, Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, I think you had a question followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thanks, Convener. Good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. I think we can all welcome efforts to encourage new entrants into farming, and obviously hope that these efforts encourage just that. I was just wondering if the Cabinet Secretary has any concerns of any potential abuse or artificial workarounds in relation to the legislation and the aspects of it, and if so, what safeguards have been or could be put in place to address those?
Well, we've set out effectively additional rights which will accrue to an existing tenant farmer, and I believe that we have set out those rights in a way that will allow this new system to function and function well. What measures have we taken to prevent, if you like, circumvention? Well, the draftsmanship, of course, has been the result of a long and considered process. But secondly, and I think this is probably the main thing, is that there has been a fairly extensive engagement with the parties involved to secure a broad consensus amongst the main representative bodies, and working with them as I do, as Mr. Halcrow-Johnson does, as we all do, we know that they have a wealth of experience, millennia, not just centuries of experience, frankly, given the senior members of the farming community that tend to populate these bodies. So I'm confident that we've come up with a workable scheme, and I'm not really aware of any specific, if you like, avoidance or circumvention plan that could operate here. I don't know if Mr. Halcrow-Johnson has got anything in mind. If so, he might want to share it with us now. But I'm personally not aware of any obvious plan that would be able, if you like, to thwart the intent of this legislation. I don't think that's likely to happen, but obviously we'll keep all these things under review.
Jamie, do you want to come back on that, or are you happy with the answer? Sorry.
Yeah, I suppose there was one issue that was raised with me, and that was potential for pass on a younger family member with the potential that value would then increase. And I was wondering if that was an area that could be an area of concern, or if there is safeguards within either the legislation itself, or the regulations themselves, or the super scrutiny to ensure that doesn't happen. I don't know if you heard that, Cabinet Secretary. Sorry if that.
I'm very sorry. I couldn't, Convener, make out that very clearly at all. Sorry.
Nor could I. So, Jamie, could you repeat it, please?
Okay, I'll try and speak louder and a bit closer to the microphone. So apologies for that. One of the issues that had been raised with myself and family member, because obviously then the value may be higher, with a view to still then transferring it on further. I was just wondering if that's an area of concern, or whether there is the scrutiny of that and supervisory of that in place, so that doesn't happen.
Did you get that, Cabinet Secretary?
I think I got the gist of it, and I will ask officials to come in after me. My first reaction, I think, is that any assignation per se would have to be an assignation, by the existing tenant farmer to a relative. I think, that's a process that's already heavily regulated and controlled, and therefore any anti-abuse measures, if that's how it's seen, would be dealt with by the pre-existing legislation, and not really something which, if you like, if it is a factor, would be a factor as a result of anything that we're doing this morning. But that's just off the top of my head, and it's I'm not quite sure I've totally grasped the scenario. So maybe it'd be best if one of my officials could add anything, okay, convener, if they have anything to add.
So I'm going to bring in Kirsty. My understanding is that the question is assignation of the tenancy is controlled under of who can be an appropriate assignee, is what the Cabinet Secretary is saying for the assignation. And I think, Kirsty, what we're asking is if you can clarify that. Is that right, Cabinet Secretary?
Yes.
Yes, I would confirm what the Cabinet Secretary has already said. The existing provisions on when a landlord's entitled to object to a proposed assignee are already fairly tight. And I think if somebody was proposing to assign to somebody who had no farming experience purely for the purposes of trying to get round any of the valuation requirements in these provisions in Part 3A, then the landlord would have solid grounds for objecting to that assignation on the basis that the person wasn't an appropriate assignee in terms of the existing provisions, which I think are in Section 10A of the 1991 Act. It's not something that has been addressed specifically in these regulations for that reason. And equally, I mean, on a related point, the proposed assignees at the end of the relinquishment and assignation process, the landlord also has an opportunity to object to. So there are controls for the landlord built into the process, both in terms of the existing assignation process and in terms of the new assignation process that's being proposed.
Okay, thank you, Kirsty. I'd certainly forgotten the section in the Act, but thanks for reminding me. I'll have a look at it. Cabinet Secretary, if you're happy with that answer, there seems to be one more from Peter Chapman, and then we'll move on to the next item. Cabinet Secretary, Peter Chapman.
Thanks, Convener. There is a concern, Cabinet Secretary, out there that one way or another an established farmer might manage to get round the rules and regulations and be able to outbid a new person or what you call an advancing farmer. What safeguards are in place to ensure that it is a new farmer or someone who is relatively new and advancing in the industry that gets the tenancy, rather than somebody that maybe has a fairly well-established business and would probably be able to offer a bit more to the outgoing tenant to take over the tenancy? And there's a concern that there are people out there that would try to achieve that and get more land rather than a new entrant.
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, well, the legislation, I believe, sets out to define the two categories of qualifying, i.e. kind of permitted assignees. And these are new entrants, but also, secondly, those who wish to progress, a person progressing in farming. And obviously, Convener, because I think Mr. Chapman's question is a fair enough question, because these were the groups that we wish to, if you like, benefit, i.e. by conferring rights upon them to be the qualifying prospective assignees. The definitions of both new entrant and progressing farmers have taken considerable consideration to make sure they deliver the policy objectives, that they're as fair as possible to outgoing tenants, potential incoming tenants and landlords, and the opportunities for abuse are eliminated or at least minimised. So these matters were quite rightly the subject of quite a lot of careful consideration. And I think it was right that we went beyond new entrants to people progressing in farming. The definitions, convener, are there for members to see. I don't propose to read them out. I've looked at them before, and I do think that broadly speaking, the approach we've taken is one that not only meets the policy objective of encouraging new people into farming, but doesn't exclude those who've, if you like, maybe just got a first rung on the ladder and want to move up the ladder. Because it's realistic, I think, to assume that the sort of people that will make a success of farming are people that have had the experience I've referred to earlier of working in the farming world in various different categories, but want a farm of their own. So not just new entrants, but people progressing in farming. The definitions have been very much drafted in accordance with Mr. Chapman's fears in mind, and namely to encourage precision and certainty. Those are the two desiderata of good law.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I think we've gone through all the questions. So if that's right, we're going to move on to agenda item 4. This is the consideration of motion S5M 23935 that the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee recommends that the Agricultural Holdings Relinquishment and Assignation Application to Relevant Partnerships Scotland Regulations 2020 be approved. Now, Cabinet Secretary, can I ask you to move the motion and to confirm you have nothing further to say?
Moved and confirmed.
Thank you very much. Are there any comments from any members? There are not any comments from any members. So the question is to members that motion S5M 23935 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yep, I'm noticing nodding heads and thumbs up. So that is agreed. Cabinet Secretary, I'd like to thank you and your officials for your time. And we are now going to move on to agenda item 5 of the agenda, which is the consideration of a subordinate legislation, 2 negative instruments and 1 late-only instrument as detailed on the agenda. Now, the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee have considered these instruments. The Animals, Food and Feed EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020 SSI 2020-455 was reported for failure to lay the instrument in accordance with laying requirements and also under the general reporting ground due to the text being included in error in Regulation 5.2c. The DPLR Committee notes it is satisfied with the explanation that has been given by the Scottish Government to that committee for the failure to comply with the rule. And the Scottish Government has committed to omit the text included in error in a forthcoming SSI. The laid-only instrument is the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016 Commencement Number 12 Regulations 2020 was included on the agenda for the committee only to note. Now, no motions have been to annul have been received in relation to these instruments. And does any member wish to make any comments on any of these? Absolute silence. So I propose, therefore, that the committee does not make any recommendations in relation to these instruments. And I assume that that is agreed. Is therefore agreed. Therefore, we will move on to agenda item 6, with the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. We have received a consent notification in relation to 1 UK statutory instrument as detailed at item 6 on the agenda. This instrument is being laid in the UK Parliament in relation to the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. The following issues were brought to our attention in the papers. Similar to the notification which the committee considered last week, the committee has been given only a very short time to consider this instrument. It is also suggested that the committee may wish to ask the Scottish Government to keep it informed if it appears that significant irregularity and infringements have occurred while derogations proposed by this SI are in place. Do any member have any wish to make any comment on what I've just said? So, sorry, Maureen, did you want to make a comment? Maureen.
Just on that point where you're suggesting that we may wish to ask the Scottish Government to keep us informed, I mean, is that just going to be the question to the Scottish Government and nothing else in relation to this SI?
Okay, thank you, Maureen. What I was going to, sorry, excuse me. What I was going to propose is that the committee write to the Scottish Government to confirm its content for the consent to the UK SIs, and in doing so, the committee highlights the two issues that we've just brought. So just really to say that if anything changes, having looked at these, that we're informed as a committee so we can reconsider them if necessary. Are you happy with that explanation, Maureen? Yes. Okay. So I'm going to put that question, therefore, to the committees. Does the committee agree to write to the Scottish Government to confirm it is content for consent to the UK SIs referred to in the notification be given? And in doing so, is the committee also content to highlight the two issues that we have just discussed and have been brought to our attention in the papers? I'm not seeing anyone disagreeing. So that really is all on the things. Just to remind committee members that the next meeting will be on the 3rd of February, which will be in the morning, and the climate change plan will be part of that meeting, in that we'll have a further evidence session which will cover parts of the plan which relate to agriculture and forestry. And we will have one SSI and two SIs. Could I say that, just to remind committee members, that we will now go to another means to discuss the evidence that we've heard this morning, but that concludes our meeting in public today. Thank you very much, and I will see you on the other channel. I therefore close this meeting.